Hello and welcome to Sleepy Whisper. If you haven't already, please set your volume to a gentle level. Now close your eyes, lie still, and let the noise of the day drift far, far away. Tonight, we begin the very first story in our Sleepy History series. It's called How Cathedrals Took Generations to Finish, a quiet tale of stone, patience, and centuries of silent work. Before we begin, if this helps you relax or fall asleep, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It means a lot, and it helps us share more calm stories like this with others. Now let's drift back in time. Cathedrals are some of the most majestic and awe-inspiring structures ever created by human hands. And yet, what makes them truly remarkable is not just their height or the intricate beauty of their stained glass windows, but the fact that they often took generations, sometimes several centuries, to complete. Imagine walking by the same construction site every day of your life, watching the walls slowly rise, the scaffolding shift and move, the stones being cut and placed with care, and yet never living long enough to see the finished building. That was the reality for countless craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers in medieval Europe, who devoted their lives to projects they knew they would never see completed. There's something quietly profound in that kind of dedication, something nearly forgotten in today's fast-paced world of deadlines and quick returns. Let us begin by stepping back into the 13th century, in a time when communities were smaller, life was harder, and faith often held a stronger presence in daily life. Townspeople would gather for Mass in modest chapels, but one day, plans would be announced for a cathedral, a structure so grand, so tall, and so beautiful that it would inspire awe in all who saw it. The cathedral wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of hope, pride, and purpose. But these cathedrals weren't built overnight. Construction of a single cathedral could take 50, 100, or even 300 years. Why so long? The answer lies in the sheer ambition of the designs, the limited tools of the time, and the fact that each stone, each beam, each sculpture had to be carved, hoisted, and placed by hand. Take, for example, the Cologne Cathedral in Germany. Its foundation stone was laid in the year 1248, but it wasn't fully completed until 1880, over 600 years later. 6 centuries of history passed through Europe during that time. Entire dynasties rose and fell. Wars were fought and forgotten. The printing press was invented. New continents were discovered. And yet, through all that, the cathedral remained unfinished, standing like a skeleton of stone and ambition, quietly waiting. And still, generation after generation, builders returned to it. They didn't abandon the dream just because it was slow. They saw their role as one part of a much larger story. They weren't building for themselves. They were building for the future. For many of these craftsmen, cathedral work was a family tradition. A father might spend his youth carving decorative patterns into the choir stalls, and years later, his son might work on a section of the nave, while his grandson helped to lift heavy stones into place for the bell tower. They shared not only a trade, but a quiet pride, an understanding that the beauty they were creating would outlive them. There was no internet, no news cameras, no magazines to capture their names. Most of these workers remain anonymous to this day, but their work endures in every archway, every buttress, every window that catches the sunlight just right. These buildings were engineering marvels of their time. They required advanced knowledge of geometry, weight distribution, and materials. Knowledge that was often passed down orally or recorded in hand-drawn sketches and guarded with care. Master builders would travel from town to town, hired for their rare expertise, and they were respected not just as craftsmen, but as visionaries. Still, progress was painfully slow. Funds would run out, political turmoil or plague might halt construction for decades. Sometimes, cathedrals stood half-finished, with exposed wooden beams and crumbling facades, waiting for the next wave of funding or the next generation of hands to take over. Yet somehow, the work always resumed. And then there were the communities who rallied around the construction. Peasants and nobles alike would donate coins, materials, or labor. Pilgrims came from distant lands and left offerings. Artists carved angels and saints into stone. Monks copied designs. Even local farmers might offer carts and oxen to help transport limestone. Everyone had a role to play, no matter how small. Because when a cathedral was being built, it wasn't just a project, it was a shared dream, a promise to the future that beauty and devotion could be made permanent. even in a world so fragile and fleeting. And so, through wind and rain, through war and peace, through births and funerals, the cathedral slowly grew, stone by stone, inch by inch, year after year. Their walls absorbed centuries of stories, of whispered prayers, of secret hopes, of chisel strikes and hammer taps echoing through the air. Every carved statue and spire was not just a work of art, but a testament to the patience and persistence of ordinary people who believed in something bigger than themselves. As the cathedral walls continued to rise, slowly and steadily over the years, life unfolded around them. Babies were born within view of the stone towers, children played in the shadow of unfinished arches, and elders sat on wooden benches watching the progress, remembering when the ground was just grass and scattered tools. The rhythm of construction became part of the rhythm of the town itself. It was something people measured their lives by. They just finished the rose window, someone might say, the same year our daughter was born. Decades later, they might say, they've started the bell tower while watching their grandchildren learn to walk. It's difficult for modern minds to imagine time stretched out like that. Today, we want things fast. We order something and expect it tomorrow. We set goals for months, not lifetimes. But for the medieval builders, the slow pace wasn't frustrating, it was expected. It was part of the process, and in many ways, part of the point. Greatness wasn't rushed, and nothing embodied that belief more than a cathedral. The work was physical, back-breaking even. Stone didn't yield easily. Builders didn't have the machines we rely on now. Each stone had to be carved by hand using chisels and hammers. Hoisting them into place involved ropes, pulleys, and raw strength. Wooden scaffolds groaned under the weight of men and materials. Dust clung to the skin. Blisters formed on hands that never truly healed. Winters were brutal, with freezing temperatures slowing everything down. Summers brought heat, sweat, and exhaustion. But the workers kept going. They didn't complain, not because they didn't feel the pain, but because they knew the work mattered. It wasn't just a job, it was purpose. There's a quiet power in that kind of dedication. It's not loud or showy, it doesn't need recognition. It's the kind of strength that comes from showing up every day and giving your best, even when no one is watching. That's the spirit that built the cathedrals. The master builders, known as architects in the broadest sense, carried in their minds a vision so large it could take multiple lifetimes to complete. They had to think not just in inches and feet, but in centuries. Their blueprints were sketched on parchment, revised constantly as new sections rose, and yet those plans were respected like sacred texts. When one master passed away, the next picked up where he left off, adding his own adjustments, his own interpretation of the vision, but always respecting the foundation. It was collaboration across time, one generation's dream, another's responsibility. The result was a kind of architectural conversation, a dialogue in stone between people who never met yet shared the same mission. For the local townspeople, the cathedral was more than a symbol of religion. It was part of their identity. It stood at the center of their lives, literally and emotionally. Markets were held nearby. Announcements were made on the steps. Celebrations and mourning took place beneath its incomplete vaults. It was the backdrop to weddings, funerals, and everything in between. And every villager, no matter how poor or unimportant they seemed, felt connected to it. Perhaps they donated a small coin, or hauled a bucket of mortar, or carved their initials in the stones lying around the site as children. In some way, they were part of it. The cathedral gave people a reason to look up, both physically and spiritually. There's something deeply human about building something you know you'll never see finished. It's an act of faith, not just in God, but in the future, in people yet to be born, in hands that will continue your work long after yours are gone. That kind of faith shaped every cathedral stone. It wasn't about perfection. In fact, if you look closely at old cathedrals, you'll see little flaws. A crooked gargoyle, an uneven carving, a patch of stone that doesn't quite match. These weren't mistakes, they were signatures. They were signs that humans were here, that they tried, that they cared. Even in imperfection, there was beauty. And somehow, those imperfections made the buildings feel more alive, more real, more lasting. As time passed, the cathedral kept rising, slowly, quietly, through revolutions, reforms, and renaissances. New styles emerged. Gothic became Baroque, arches became domes, but the heart remained the same, a sacred space, a place for light and shadow, for silence and song. For every hand that ever touched stone, and every eye that ever looked up and wondered how it was possible. And still, the work continued. As the generations passed, the stories surrounding the cathedral began to blend into the rhythm of everyday life. The people who worked on it came and went. Some stayed for decades, while others left after a season, their names forgotten, but their fingerprints hidden deep within the stone. Apprentices arrived as young boys, wide-eyed and eager, often the sons or nephews of laborers already on site. They'd start with simple tasks, sweeping the stone dust, carrying tools, helping to mix mortar. As years went by, they'd graduate to shaping stone blocks, climbing scaffolds, learning from the older craftsmen who treated their trade with quiet reverence. These weren't jobs taken for fame or riches. They were humble roles in an enormous, almost sacred process. The pride didn't come from the paycheck. It came from the knowledge that the work would last beyond their own lives. The tools they used, chisels worn smooth by generations of hands, were sometimes passed down from father to son, like family heirlooms. The marks left by those tools were not just functional, but deeply personal. If you walk through one of these cathedrals today and look closely at the columns and arches, you might see faint symbols or small carvings tucked away in the stone. These weren't decorative flourishes for the public. They were messages from the past. Signatures, prayers, initials, or marks used to count one's work. Each one a quiet whisper from someone long gone, someone who helped shape the space you're now standing in. These buildings were more than religious monuments. They were acts of belief in time itself. Unlike castles built to intimidate or defend, cathedrals were designed to elevate. Their soaring ceilings, stained glass windows, and echoing chambers were meant to inspire awe, to remind people of the heavens, to create a space where the divine felt a little closer. And yet that sense of wonder didn't only come from the architecture. It came from the hands that built it. The beauty wasn't just in the spires reaching skyward, but in the patience it took to raise them. Think of what it meant to carve a statue that would sit 100 feet above ground, where most people would never see it up close. Think of what it meant to polish a hidden corner of stone simply because it was the right thing to do. That kind of work speaks to a mindset we rarely see today, one where meaning isn't tied to visibility, where effort is its own reward. Meanwhile, life continued to unfold around the construction. Markets were set up near the scaffolds. Festivals were held in the shadows of half-finished towers. Children born when the foundation was laid grew old watching the nave come together. Some of them might have joined the workforce. Others might have married under the wooden beams, or buried their parents in the cathedral's cemetery before the roof was even sealed. Entire lives happened under the slow, steady watch of stone. Sometimes work would pause, not by choice, but due to war, plague, or lack of funds. And yet, even after decades of silence, construction would resume, like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. The stones waited patiently, so did the people. It's worth noting that these projects didn't just survive, they adapted. As time passed, new architectural techniques emerged. The original plans were updated, expanded, or even completely revised. Later builders added flying buttresses, larger domes, or elaborate facades. And still, the overall vision held steady. It's a reminder that great things aren't built in a straight line. They evolve. They change with time, just like the people who build them. But that doesn't diminish their beauty. If anything, it makes them more alive. Living histories, shaped not by one mind, but by thousands. Even the materials told stories. The stone used in construction was often sourced from local quarries, hauled to the site over miles of rough terrain. Some stones were reused from older buildings, giving them a second life. Others were transported across rivers and hills by oxen and carts, each journey taking days or weeks. Every block placed into the cathedral had a story before it ever touched the mortar. A story of movement, of labor, of preparation. And once it was in place, it stayed there, absorbing centuries of silence, of footsteps, of whispered prayers and organ music. And when, finally, a cathedral was completed, when the last bell was hung and the last window glazed, it didn't signal the end. It marked a new beginning. The cathedral became the heart of the town. Pilgrims traveled great distances to see it. Artists were inspired by it. Generations that had nothing to do with the building itself still felt proud of it, because it wasn't just made of stone and glass, it was made of patience, of belief, of time. By the time a cathedral was finally completed, the town around it often looked very different from when the first stone had been laid. Generations had passed, languages had shifted slightly, fashion had changed. Even the landscape itself might have transformed, with forests cleared, roads built, and homes expanded in the shadow of the growing structure. But the cathedral remained at the center. It became not only a place of worship, but a landmark, a compass point for the community's memory. People didn't just say, "I live in this town." They said, "I live near the cathedral." The tall spire became a familiar shape on the horizon, something you could see from miles away. Travelers used it to find their way. Locals used it to mark time, its bells ringing to signal mass, weddings, and funerals. The cathedral was there for all of life's biggest moments: baptisms, first communions, confirmations, marriage vows whispered beneath stained glass light, and eulogies spoken softly while organ notes drifted high into the vaulted ceiling. It didn't matter whether you believed in every word preached inside its walls or not. The building held space for you anyway. It became part of people's identity, part of their daily view, and eventually part of their story. The people who had built it, those long gone, might not have imagined the exact future their work would live in, but they trusted that it would matter. They trusted that someone, someday, would walk through those doors in awe. And they were right. If you've ever walked inside one of these cathedrals, Notre Dame in Paris, or York Minster in England, or Seville Cathedral in Spain, you've likely felt that hush, that pause when your eyes lift upward and you realize just how high the ceilings are, just how carefully everything was made. There's a reason we whisper when we walk inside, even if no one tells us to. Something about the space asks for silence, not out of fear, but out of respect. You feel small in the best way, not insignificant, but connected, reminded that humans, in all their fragility, are still capable of building beauty that lasts. It's a kind of quiet magic, one made not from spells or illusions, but from wood, stone, light, and time. What's even more remarkable is how these cathedrals managed to survive. Fires, wars, earthquakes, political upheavals, many cathedrals were damaged, sometimes severely, and yet people rebuilt them, repaired roofs, replaced windows, reinforced foundations. Not because it was easy or cheap, but because it mattered. Because the idea of the cathedral, a place built with love for something greater than any one person, was worth preserving. You see, a cathedral is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just walls and windows, it's intention, it's hope in stone. And when something built on hope is damaged, people tend to gather around it to try and make it whole again. This has happened countless times throughout history. After World War II, when bombs had shattered parts of Coventry Cathedral in England, people didn't just abandon it. They preserved the ruins and built a new cathedral beside it, modern in design, but deeply tied to the old. It was a way of honoring both past and present. A way of saying, we remember, and we continue. Many of these cathedrals today are considered heritage sites. Tourists come from all over the world to walk through them, to marvel at the craftsmanship, to feel that ancient air. But beneath the surface of the tourism and the guidebooks and the camera flashes, the original spirit still lingers. You can still sense the devotion behind every carved arch and every hand-painted ceiling. The sense that someone long ago stood exactly where you're standing now, not to take a photo or post online, but to build, to believe, to be part of something bigger than themselves. Perhaps the most powerful thing about these cathedrals is not their size or their age or even their beauty, but their patience. They are slow stories written in stone, stories that span centuries, stories that began with a dream and ended in silence long after the dreamer was gone. And somehow, that makes them even more human. Because isn't that what we all hope for in some way? To leave something behind, something good, something lasting. Most of us won't build cathedrals, but we build in other ways. A kind word, a helping hand, a piece of music, a garden, a family, a memory. These are cathedrals too, invisible ones, carried inside the people we touch. And maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson these cathedrals whisper to us as we stand quietly in their shadows. That the work we do now, no matter how small, can echo forward, that it's okay if we don't finish the story ourselves, as long as we help write a chapter worth reading. In many ways, the story of cathedral construction is not just a story of architecture or religion, it's a story of time itself. Unlike modern buildings, which are often conceived, approved, and completed in a matter of years or even months, these cathedrals were born into timelines that spanned entire eras. The decisions made at the foundation stage would impact generations of builders and citizens long after the original plans were drawn. It's easy to forget that the people who laid those foundations had no certainty. They didn't know if the project would be completed. They didn't know if political unrest, famine, or plague would derail it. And yet they built anyway. They chose to believe in something that might outlive them. That belief, that trust in the long term, is something rare in our world today, where results are often expected immediately and patience can feel like a lost virtue. But cathedral builders lived differently. Their work was quiet, repetitive, and often physically painful. Yet it was filled with purpose. They weren't building just for themselves, or even for their own children. They were building for the grandchildren of people they would never meet. That kind of forward thinking, that kind of humility, is woven into every block of stone. The economic and social structures that made these cathedrals possible were also unique to their time. Often, construction was funded by a mix of church wealth, royal patronage, and public donation. Sometimes, entire towns would come together to raise money for a new section of the building. Special taxes might be levied. Guilds of merchants or craftsmen would sponsor chapels, altars, or stained glass windows. It was seen not only as a religious duty, but a civic one, a way of giving back, of contributing to something beautiful and lasting. Even the poorest townspeople would give what little they could, not because they expected a reward, but because they wanted to be part of the story. In some places, names of donors were inscribed in stone or recorded in ledgers, but in most cases, these gifts were anonymous, silent acts of generosity offered in the hope that they might help shape something greater. And they did. The construction sites themselves were not static places. They were evolving, shifting organisms filled with noise, movement, and life. Workmen shouted over the clanging of tools, dust drifted through the air, pulleys creaked. Stone blocks were carefully hoisted and guided into place by teams who knew every inch mattered. There were risks, too. Injuries were common, scaffolding collapsed, stones cracked. Mistakes could set back months of progress. And yet the laborers returned each day. Not because it was easy, but because it was important. Some builders were paid. Others worked in exchange for food, housing, or spiritual reward. Many had no formal education but were masters of their craft, having learned through years of apprenticeship and observation. There were masons who could shape blocks so precisely that they fit together without mortar. There were glaziers who painted scenes from scripture in delicate colors that still glow today when sunlight passes through. There were woodworkers, metalworkers, and artists whose names we'll never know, but whose work lives on. As the cathedral grew, so did the community around it. Inns, bakeries, blacksmiths, and workshops often sprang up near the construction site. These buildings served both the workers and the influx of visitors who came to see the progress. Pilgrims arrived from distant towns, hoping to pray near relics or simply to witness the rising towers. These pilgrims brought not only devotion but commerce. Markets thrived, stories were exchanged. The presence of a cathedral could elevate a town from obscurity to prominence. In this way, the cathedral shaped not only the skyline, but the entire social fabric of the place it inhabited. What's remarkable is how these buildings managed to retain their sense of sacredness, despite the activity and noise around them. Even when half-finished, even when missing a roof or a spire, the cathedral was treated with reverence. Workers would pause for prayer. Bells would toll at set hours. Special days were observed with ceremonies, even if the nave was still open to the sky. It was as if everyone involved, architects, laborers, donors, priests, understood that they were part of something eternal, that their individual role, however small, contributed to a structure that would stand long after they were gone. And that, perhaps, is the quiet legacy of cathedral building, the realization that true greatness often requires patience, humility, and a willingness to work without immediate reward. That some of the most enduring things in life are not rushed, but nurtured over time. That beauty, when built with care, does not fade, it deepens. The cathedrals remind us that progress doesn't have to be fast to be meaningful, that work done with love, even in silence, can echo through centuries. As the centuries moved forward and the final stones of many cathedrals were eventually set into place, their completion did not mark an ending, but rather the beginning of a new phase in their existence. Though the scaffolds came down and the tools were stored away, the buildings themselves took on lives of their own, hosting rituals, echoing hymns, and bearing witness to generations of joy, grief, hope, and resilience. A cathedral never truly finished its role. It evolved, it adapted. It stood, stoic and silent, through changing governments, changing borders, changing beliefs. And within its walls, history quietly accumulated. Dust settled on old pews, candles burned through countless evenings. The air, thick with incense and whispers, seemed to remember. Even today, walking through the nave of a cathedral that took centuries to build is a peculiar experience. There's a strange layering of time, of memory. You may stand on a stone slab, worn smooth by thousands of footsteps, lean against a column that once supported wooden scaffolding centuries ago, or glance up at a ceiling painted by hands that worked by candlelight, decades before the invention of the printing press. The building holds all of it. It is both artifact and vessel. The passage of time did not treat every cathedral equally. Some remained pristine, well-maintained by successive generations who valued their beauty and function. Others fell into disrepair as wars broke out. Cities declined, or new ideologies rejected the old structures. Still, the bones of the buildings endured. Even in ruin, cathedrals could be breathtaking, arches open to the sky, grass growing between the cracks of what was once a floor for choirs and kings. And in many cases, communities came together to restore what had been lost. Restoration itself became a form of devotion. Teams of historians, artisans, and engineers would labor for years, sometimes decades, to repair what had taken centuries to create. They studied the original construction methods, sourced similar materials, and attempted to match the spirit of the original work, not just its appearance. In doing so, they extended the story. They added new chapters to a living book. The interiors of cathedrals became museums of meaning. Statues lined the aisles, some chipped, some polished, each with a story. Memorial plaques dotted the walls, commemorating bishops, kings, architects, and anonymous parishioners alike. Stained glass windows told entire biblical narratives in color and light, and in the early morning or just before dusk, the sun would pass through the glass and scatter soft patterns across the stone floors, transforming the space into something almost otherworldly. These moments, simple and quiet, were not engineered for tourists or cameras. They were part of the rhythm of the building itself. The way light and shadow played inside those ancient walls was as much a part of the architecture as the flying buttresses and vaulted ceilings. In some cathedrals, visitors can still climb the narrow staircases that wind through towers and lead to sweeping views of the surrounding town. The climb is steep, the air grows thinner, and the steps are worn, sometimes uneven from centuries of use. But at the top, there's silence. The bells rest in their frames. The rooftops stretch out below, and for a moment, time feels still. It's easy to imagine what the world looked like hundreds of years ago, when someone else, perhaps a young apprentice or a curious monk, stood in the same place, looking out at a landscape that has both changed completely and not at all. These towers, these stone sentinels, have watched the world grow, and they have endured not by resisting change, but by weathering it with grace. It's also worth reflecting on how these cathedrals shaped the people who lived near them. They influenced art, music, education, even language. The church was often the only place in town where large gatherings could happen indoors. It was a shelter during storms, a place to gather during harvest celebrations, and a point of refuge during moments of fear. Children played in its courtyards, scholars taught in its chapels, travelers sought directions in its shadow. In countless ways, the cathedral was the beating heart of the town, pumping both spiritual and practical lifeblood into the community. And yet, it never demanded praise. It never boasted. It simply stood, waiting with patience and dignity. Today, in an age of steel and glass, when cities grow upward at a staggering pace and buildings rise in months rather than lifetimes, it can be hard to comprehend what it meant to dedicate one's life to a single wall, a single carving, or a single arch. But perhaps that's exactly why these cathedrals continue to move us. Not because they are reminders of the past, but because they show us something timeless, that human beings, no matter the century, have always longed to create something that lasts, not just for utility, but for beauty, for meaning, for connection. In every cathedral's quiet corner, in every curve of stone and flicker of light, that longing is still there, whispering to anyone willing to pause long enough to listen. Beyond the visible stone and glass, behind the beauty that draws millions of eyes each year, lies something deeper and more difficult to describe, something that cannot be measured by height, width, or architectural style. What makes cathedrals truly extraordinary is not just how they look, but how they were built. Slowly, steadily, with an intention rooted in patience and humility. These were not vanity projects or commercial ventures. No builder expected quick fame. No craftsman laid a stone believing their name would one day be etched in marble. Their motivation was quiet. It came from faith, from duty, from love of craft. In many cases, the people who worked on these cathedrals lived in modest homes, ate simple meals, and endured lives filled with physical hardship. Yet day after day, they returned to the site, picked up their tools, and shaped their portion of the whole. Perhaps it was a gargoyle, perhaps a pillar, or maybe just a stair carved into a spiral. It might have taken months to complete. And they knew, almost certainly, that their work would be placed far above eye level, out of reach, out of view, and likely never pointed out to tourists or mentioned in books. Still, they cared. Still, they shaped it with care. There's something profoundly human about that. The idea that our finest work might go unnoticed, yet still be worth doing. That it matters not because it will be seen, but because it exists. Cathedrals, in this way, are monuments to quiet excellence, to craftsmanship done for its own sake, to effort made not for applause, but for the simple satisfaction of doing something right. They teach us that true meaning often comes from the process, not the result, and that the process, when repeated with care across decades and centuries, can yield something so vast, so intricate, and so enduring that it leaves future generations in awe. Consider the ceilings of these great cathedrals. Vaulted high above, the ribs of stone meet in perfect symmetry, forming patterns that feel both mathematical and mystical. They serve a purpose, of course, to support the structure, but they also elevate the eye, drawing it upward, reminding the visitor to look beyond the ordinary. These ceilings were not quickly drafted or easily built. They required planning, measurement, trial, and error. Mistakes were costly, adjustments required strength and ingenuity. Yet even with rudimentary tools and no modern machinery, medieval builders achieved a level of precision that continues to inspire architects today. It's tempting to think that such feats were the product of genius, but they were not. They were the product of persistence, of generations learning from one another, of skills refined slowly, passed down with reverence. It was not one person's brilliance that made the ceiling soar. It was the collaboration of hundreds, each contributing a line to the drawing, a chisel mark to the stone. Outside, the facades tell stories in silence. Rows of statues line the entrances, each one representing a figure from scripture, legend, or local tradition. The expressions on their faces, sometimes stern, sometimes serene, have watched over cities for centuries. Rain has softened their features. Wind has worn their edges, and yet they remain. These stone guardians are not merely decorative. They are storytellers in stillness, reminding passers-by of the values, fears, and hopes of those who came before. To carve one of these figures took weeks, sometimes longer. Artists worked from memory or from sketches. They used trial and feel to coax detail from cold stone. And when they were done, they stepped back, often unsure how long their work would survive, or whether anyone would ever know their name. But again, that didn't matter. What mattered was that the work was done well, that it added something beautiful to the whole. The bells of the cathedral, too, deserve mention. Suspended high above the floor, hidden in towers, they are heard, but rarely seen. Cast from bronze and tuned with precision, these bells are rung to mark time, to call people to prayer, to celebrate, to mourn. Each bell has its own tone, its own story. Some were gifts. Some were recast after cracks or war. Some were rung by hand for generations before being mechanized. And when they sound, deep, resonant, and slow, They fill the space with something that feels older than language. The vibration moves through walls and bodies alike. It doesn't just mark the hour. It reminds you that time is passing, and that even the most permanent-seeming things, like cathedrals, exist within that flow. In this way, every part of a cathedral, seen and unseen, grand and modest, carries the imprint of time and care. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is meaningless. The cathedral, then, is not only a house of worship. It is a memory made solid, a vision built stone by stone, day by day, by hands that knew they were building something they might never see finished, but believed deeply that it was worth building anyway. As we move deeper into the life of these cathedrals, it becomes clear that their endurance is not simply architectural, but cultural, emotional, even spiritual. The buildings became mirrors of the societies around them, absorbing the tastes, values, and changes of each generation that lived in their shadow. No cathedral remained frozen in time. Though their foundations might date back to the 12th or 13th century, they evolved continuously, one century adding a new altar, the next introducing different forms of art, another restoring what fire or weather had worn away. In some cases, parts were never truly finished. A tower might remain asymmetrical. A set of statues might never have been carved. These imperfections don't make the cathedrals lesser. In fact, they make them more human. They remind us that history is not always neat or complete. Sometimes, the unfinished piece tells the richest story. Inside, the furniture and decor also shifted over the centuries. Pews were added long after the first services were held. Organs, often immense in scale, were installed and expanded with each passing generation. Choir screens were built, removed, then rebuilt again. Paintings were hung, taken down, moved, and rehung according to taste and leadership. And throughout all this change, the people kept coming. They gathered to light candles, to kneel and pray, to celebrate holidays or mourn losses. Even those with no strong religious ties were drawn to the space, sensing that something sacred lingered in the quiet air, in the smell of wax and stone, in the way light poured through the stained glass and scattered gently across the flagstones. The cathedral became a kind of memory bank, not just of events, but of feelings. Joy, sorrow, awe, reverence, all of it became etched into the walls, like invisible carvings that only the heart can read. For the local communities, the cathedral also served as a kind of timekeeper. Its bells marked the rhythm of the day: morning prayers, midday rest, evening reflection. In an era before clocks were common, this rhythm helped organize both labor and leisure. Farmers knew when to return from the fields. Merchants knew when to close their stalls. Children knew when to return home. Over time, these sounds became part of the background of daily life, as familiar as the changing seasons. Even now, in many European towns, the cathedral bells still ring, even if most people no longer rely on them to tell time. They are a link to something older, a sound passed down through generations, comforting in its constancy. The artwork found within these cathedrals also tells a layered story. Much of it is religious in nature, scenes from the Bible, depictions of saints and angels, but look closer, and you begin to see the fingerprints of everyday life. A woodcarver in the 14th century might have included a tiny animal tucked beneath a pew, or a stonemason may have sculpted a local figure into a corner of a chapel. These weren't errors or distractions. They were gifts, small, quiet signatures left behind. Art was not separate from life. It was woven into it. And so the cathedrals became not only houses of worship, but museums of memory. Every corner, every niche, every bit of ornamentation became a message from the past. And these messages, though silent, still speak to anyone willing to notice. Even the wear and tear within these cathedrals carries meaning. The smoothness of the steps worn down by centuries of feet. The polished stone railings where countless hands have rested. The faded edges of murals, touched by time and candle smoke. These marks of use and age are not flaws. They are the physical evidence that these spaces were lived in, loved, and needed. In many ways, the cathedral is a portrait, not of a single artist or era, but of a community stretching across time. Everyone who entered, everyone who sang, knelt, or wept inside contributed to its story. And when we step into one of these cathedrals today, we are not just visitors, we become part of that story. We walk the same paths, we breathe the same air, we see the world, if only for a moment, through the eyes of those who came before us. That is the true wonder of cathedrals. Not just that they were built slowly, with care and devotion, but that they continue to give something back. They invite us to slow down, to look closely, to listen, and in doing so, they offer a kind of stillness that is rare in our modern world, a kind of peace that doesn't need to shout to be heard. As the centuries passed and the world around them changed dramatically, the cathedrals remained steady, silent witnesses to revolutions, Reformation, industrialization, and even modern wars. Their stones held stories older than most nations, and yet they stood. Even when their spires were darkened by soot, their bells quieted by war, or their windows shattered by bombs, people still returned to them. Sometimes the rebuilding began within days, sometimes it took decades. But almost always, the response to loss was not to walk away, but to repair, to restore, to reclaim what had been broken. These acts of reconstruction were not just about stone and glass, they were about memory, meaning, and identity. People didn't just rebuild a cathedral because it was beautiful. They rebuilt it because it had become a part of them, because the building had outlived their ancestors, and, if cared for, could outlive their children. That sense of continuity, of being part of a timeline much longer than any single life, gave strength and comfort to entire communities. In times of uncertainty, cathedrals offered a sense of grounding. When cities were struck by plague, fire, or economic collapse, the cathedral's presence was a reminder that not everything was temporary. Its foundations had been laid centuries before. Its walls had seen worse. And so people came, not always to pray, but simply to be still, to sit in the quiet, to let the cool air and the echo of footsteps remind them that they were not alone, and that even in their most vulnerable moments, they were part of something greater. For some, it was a place to grieve. For others, a place to celebrate. And for many, it was simply a space where time moved differently, slower, deeper. Even the lighting inside a cathedral contributes to this feeling. Natural light filters in through tall, stained glass windows, soft, colorful, diffused. The sun's angle shifts throughout the day, casting patterns that move across the floor like living paintings. In the early morning, light may strike the eastern windows and set the altar aglow. By afternoon, the western wall glows warmly, illuminating dust floating gently in the air. In the evening, the space dims, becoming more hushed, more introspective. This rhythm of light is not artificial or hurried. It reflects the pace of nature, of the sun, of time itself, and it teaches a kind of patience. You don't rush through a cathedral, you walk. You pause, you notice. In a world filled with bright screens, quick answers, and constant movement, this change of pace can feel unfamiliar, but also deeply needed. Within these walls, silence is not awkward. It is sacred. There is no need to perform, to speak, or to impress. The space asks nothing of you. It simply offers itself. And that offering, a place of stillness, of beauty, of time carved into stone, is more than architecture. It is a kind of care, a gift passed from one generation to the next, asking only that it be respected, maintained, and occasionally noticed. For some visitors, especially those who come from places without this kind of historical depth, stepping into a cathedral can feel like time travel, not in the fantastical sense, but in the quiet realization that people lived, breathed, and believed right here hundreds of years ago. That someone in the 15th century stood exactly where you are standing now. That they looked up at the same arches, touched the same stone, heard the same bell. You are separated by centuries, but united in experience. In that moment, the gap between past and present softens. The building becomes a bridge, not only between earth and heaven, as its designers intended, but between people and time, between memory and presence. And this, perhaps, is the cathedral's greatest legacy. It is not just a structure built for worship. It is not only a monument to faith. It is a place where the human desire for permanence, for meaning, and for connection is made tangible. Each brick is a gesture of hope, each carving a whisper from the past, each arch a testament to patience. The result is something so quietly powerful that words often fail. But the feeling remains, a kind of awe, a kind of peace, a realization that we are all, in our own ways, builders of something, be it a family, a memory, a kindness. and that the things we build with care may last far longer than we do. As we come to the close of this long, slow journey through the history of cathedral building, it's worth pausing to consider what these structures really represent. Not just in stone and scale, but in meaning. A cathedral is, above all, a promise. It is a declaration made by people who knew they would not live to see its fulfillment, but believed the effort was still worth making. That is a rare kind of courage. In today's world, we are surrounded by reminders to be quick, efficient, and goal-oriented. But the builders of cathedrals lived by a different rhythm. Their timelines were measured in decades, their expectations grounded in humility, and their motivations rooted in something deeper than recognition. To lay a stone knowing it might not be joined by another for years, perhaps not even in your lifetime, is to live in a different kind of time. A time of trust. A time of continuity. The cathedrals of Europe, and a few in other parts of the world, remain some of the most visited, photographed, and admired landmarks on the planet. But to see them only as tourist destinations is to miss their heart. They are not just relics of the past. They are living testimonies to human patience, cooperation, and belief. Belief not only in a higher power, but in the power of people working together over time. Each cathedral contains within it the labor of thousands of hands, the mason who shaped the arch, the glazier who colored the window, the carpenter who climbed to hammer beams into place, the artist who painted details that might never be seen from below. Each of them played a part, and none of them could have completed it alone. It's this collaborative spirit that remains one of the most inspiring aspects of cathedral history. Modern life can feel individualistic, fast, isolated. But the story of cathedral building reminds us that some of the most extraordinary achievements in human history came not from a single genius, but from quiet, consistent teamwork. From generations of people willing to be part of a shared vision. People who passed down tools, skills, and dreams across time. They were not perfect. They made mistakes. Some projects failed. Some designs were abandoned. But many endured. Many stand today, still used, still cared for, still capable of taking one's breath away. And for all the majesty and complexity of these buildings, what they teach us is remarkably simple. That slow work can be beautiful. That unseen effort can have meaning. That it is possible to build something that outlives us, not through speed or fame, but through care. That beauty does not have to be flashy. It can be quiet. It can be earned. There is something deeply calming about that idea. In a world where so much changes so quickly, where buildings rise and fall in a few short years, where digital creations vanish with the click of a button, the cathedral endures. Not just because it was built to last, but because it was built with a different mindset. A mindset we can still learn from today. Whether we are building something physical, like a home or a community center, or something less tangible, like a relationship or a tradition, the principles are the same. Build slowly, build thoughtfully, build with others, and accept that you may not see the final result, but that does not mean your work is meaningless. As the final bell tolls at the end of a long day, and the cathedral doors close for the night, the building remains in its place, silent, unmoving, unchanged by the hurry of the world outside. It rests, as it has for centuries, under stars that have watched it for generations. And if you find yourself standing nearby in the quiet hours, you might feel it. Not a voice, not a sound, but a presence. A soft reminder that long ago, people cared enough to build something beautiful, something lasting, and that you too are capable of the same. So next time you walk past an old building or hear a bell echo in the distance, or find yourself pausing beneath a tall ceiling filled with light, remember the cathedrals. Remember the people who built them not in a rush, but with purpose. Not for profit, but for meaning. And remember that time, though it passes, can also hold. It can hold stone, it can hold memory, and if we choose carefully, it can hold us. That brings us to the end of the story. If you're still with me, gently drifting off, or simply enjoying the calm, please consider giving this video a like, and maybe subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us continue creating quiet stories like this, just for you. Now, let's continue our journey through the sleepy corners of history, with our next story in the series, what it meant to be a town clock keeper. Get comfortable, let the world fade away, and we'll begin in just a moment. In a world before digital clocks, before smartphones buzzed in our pockets and screens glowed with precision down to the second, timekeeping was a much more public and much more human affair. It wasn't something personal or private, but something shared. Towns didn't just have the time. Someone had to keep it. And in the heart of many towns and cities across Europe, from the medieval period through the early modern era, there was one figure responsible for making sure the entire community moved in rhythm: the town clock keeper. It may sound like a quaint or simple job, but the truth is, being a clock keeper was a role of trust, skill, and sometimes even quiet reverence. To be in charge of a town's time was to be responsible for its heartbeat. You woke the bakers before dawn, you signaled the opening of markets. You rang bells for prayer, for curfew, for meetings, for mourning. Timekeeping was more than just marking hours. It was organizing life itself. Most towns, especially from the 14th century onward, had a central clock tower. Sometimes it stood alone in a square. Other times, it was part of a church or a town hall. These clocks were often mechanical marvels, especially for their era. Weights, gears, iron mechanisms, wooden wheels, and long swinging pendulums all worked together in quiet harmony, provided, of course, that someone maintained them. And that someone was the clock keeper. It was not a job one stumbled into. It often required years of apprenticeship, deep familiarity with mechanical design, and a reputation for responsibility. If the clock stopped, it wasn't a minor issue. It could throw off an entire town's schedule. Merchants opened their stalls late. Workers showed up at the wrong times. Churches missed the hour for Mass. And in times of crisis, like fire or war, when bells were used to signal alarms, an inaccurate clock could be disastrous. So the clock keeper was trusted, respected, quietly essential. In some places, the clock keeper lived directly inside the tower. A small room might be tucked behind the gears and weights, no larger than a closet, with a narrow window overlooking the town square. From here, they kept watch, adjusting the mechanism when it ran too fast or too slow, winding the weights at regular intervals, cleaning the parts, repairing worn teeth in the gears. Many clock mechanisms had to be wound daily, others every few hours. There was no automation, no pause. Rain or shine, the clock keeper climbed the tower steps, checked the movement, oiled the shafts, and made sure that the bells rang exactly when they were supposed to. It was both a routine and a ritual. There's something quietly poetic in that image. A single person alone in a tower, surrounded by creaking wood and ticking gears, listening to the steady pulse of time. And while the job itself was repetitive, it was never quite the same. The seasons changed. The air grew cold in winter, stiffening the mechanisms. In summer, expansion and heat made other parts difficult to move. Bells corroded, ropes frayed. The keeper adapted, improvised, and kept going. He knew the sounds the clock should make. A sudden rattle or pause was noticed immediately. Many keepers could tell, just by sound, if the clock was off by even a few seconds. This attention to detail, maintained for decades in some cases, was a kind of devotion, one that never earned applause, but shaped the life of an entire town. Not every town had the same kind of clock. Some clocks displayed only the hour. Others were more elaborate, showing the position of the sun, the phases of the moon, or even the zodiac. In larger cities, astronomical clocks were built, massive, decorative systems with moving figures that danced or chimed on the hour. These drew visitors from afar, but behind the spectacle was always the same principle. Someone had to keep it running. The clock keeper was often invisible to the public. He worked high above, out of sight, behind wood panels or stone walls, yet his work echoed daily across rooftops and cobblestones. When the bell rang, the people trusted it. They adjusted their lives by it. They didn't question the hour. It was simply the hour. And behind that certainty was a person. One person, winding, adjusting, listening, believing. For some, the job became a lifelong calling. The tower became like a second home. Generations of the same family might take on the role. A father would teach his son how to read the mechanism, how to listen for imbalance, how to oil the gears at just the right time. There were no manuals. Everything was passed down through memory and habit. Over time, the clock keeper wasn't just a mechanic. He became part of the structure itself, part of the rhythm of the town. And in return, he received no spotlight, no fame, just the quiet pride of knowing that each time the bell rang, life below continued. on time, in sync, in motion. As timekeeping became more widespread and mechanical clocks grew in complexity, the responsibilities of the town clockkeeper also expanded. His role, once limited to winding gears and striking bells, gradually evolved into that of a local time specialist, someone whose work touched nearly every corner of civic life. In many towns, especially from the 15th century onward, the clockkeeper worked in coordination with the local church, the market, the town council, and even nearby watchmen. He was expected not just to maintain the machine, but to synchronize it with the seasons, with changing schedules, and with natural events. Some clocks had to be adjusted multiple times a year to account for variations in daylight hours. Others needed careful recalibration during religious festivals or agricultural cycles. The keeper had to anticipate these shifts before anyone else did. If the bell rang early on a feast day, or too late on a market morning, he would hear about it, and not kindly. So he learned to read the scan, he learned the rhythm of the people. And through that learning, he became more than a custodian of gears. He became a quiet observer of life. There's something beautifully steady about that idea. In an age before standardized time zones, before radio signals or atomic clocks, the entire town moved to the rhythm set by one person. And to do that well required not only skill, but intuition. The keeper became attuned to sounds and sensations most people ignored. He could hear the slight delay in a chime, feel the tension in the winding chain, smell the faint scent of rust beginning to form in damp months. The clock was not just a machine to him. It was alive in its own way, breathing in hours, exhaling minutes, ticking out a steady heartbeat above the rooftops. And he listened to it as you might listen to a sleeping child, tuned to every change, every irregular breath. As cities grew and technology advanced, some towns began to replace their manual systems with more modern ones. Automated winders, electrically driven pendulums, later even electronic timers, but many resisted. There was a comfort in the old ways, a beauty in the imperfect. Clock keepers, especially those who had worked for decades, found themselves in a strange position. Their jobs were becoming obsolete, but their knowledge was irreplaceable. No machine, no matter how accurate, could replicate the sound of a bell rung by hand at just the right moment. And so, many towns retained the role well into the 20th century. In some places, they still do. A few cathedrals and public buildings around the world continue to employ traditional clock keepers, not out of necessity, but out of respect. A recognition that time, in its truest form, is not just measured, it is experienced. Imagine waking before dawn, climbing the worn stone stairs of a tower as the city sleeps below. Each step echoes in the silence. You pass the narrow window where the first hint of morning light creeps across the square. At the top, the clock waits. Its great iron gears rest in the shadows, still but expectant. You check the tension in the cables, the alignment of the weights. You wind the mechanism, feel the resistance build in the crank, hear the slow groan of wood and metal. Then, as the sun touches the horizon, the bell rings out across the rooftops. Low, strong, unwavering. The town begins to stir. Bakers light their ovens, farmers head to the fields, and no one thinks about the sound source. They trust it, because they always have. That trust, built over generations, was earned through quiet work, through early mornings, cold fingers, and 100 small tasks done carefully, invisibly, without praise. In this way, the clockkeeper's role was both practical and symbolic. He was not just the one who kept time. He was the one who reminded people of its presence, of its passage, and of its weight. In some traditions, the clock tower was also the site of announcements, of public proclamations, of moments when the entire town turned its eyes upward to hear news, or warning, or celebration. The keeper, then, was the unseen voice behind those moments. He did not speak, but his bells did. And when they rang, they carried the stories of the day. A birth, a death, a wedding, a fire, a holiday, a war. The bell marked them all, not with words, but with rhythm, with tone. As modern life pulled people further away from the rhythms of sun and season, the clock remained. Ticking above traffic, ringing above conversations, standing as a kind of anchor in a world that was speeding up. And for those who cared to listen, there was still something reassuring in that steady presence, a reminder that even in change, some things endure, that someone, somewhere, still climbs the tower, still winds the gears, still listens for the heartbeat of the old machine, and sets the hour not by algorithm or code, but by hand, by ear, by memory. In many older European towns, the clock tower was the tallest structure on the skyline. It could be seen from miles away, rising above church steeples, rooftops, and chimneys, standing like a quiet sentinel over the town below. Travelers approaching on foot or by cart would often catch sight of the tower long before they reached the town itself. And the sight of it was more than just a landmark. It was a promise that the town ahead was organized, that it functioned, that time was kept, and lives moved in orderly rhythm. And at the center of that promise, invisible to the eye but essential to the operation, was the town clockkeeper. He may never have spoken to the travelers. He may never have met the people who walked beneath the tower each day. But his work gave shape to their lives, gave rhythm to their days. In many ways, the clock tower was the town's first public utility. Long before running water, gas, or electricity were common, time itself was shared, distributed freely through chimes and bells, through rhythm and echo. It was a service everyone relied on, but few fully understood. The mechanism that drove these clocks was, for its time, a marvel of ingenuity. Long rods and shafts connected to gears of varying sizes, escapements that regulated motion, heavy weights hung on ropes or chains, each one pulling downward to keep the entire system moving. All of it carefully calibrated to move hands on a dial or trigger a hammer to strike a bell. But even the most precise mechanism would drift without attention. Changes in temperature, humidity, and even the wear of metal on metal meant that no clock stayed accurate on its own. And so, each morning, each evening, sometimes multiple times a day, the keeper would climb the stairs, wooden or stone, and check the movement. He would listen to the tick, watch the balance, clean away dust, add a drop of oil, shift a weight by a hair's breadth. His hands, weathered from years of winding and adjusting, knew the machine's language like a musician knows an instrument. And the machine, in turn, responded to that care with reliability. But the work was not just mechanical. It was deeply personal. Many clock keepers developed a kind of relationship with the clocks they maintained. They gave them nicknames. They recorded their quirks. They made notes in ledgers not only about repairs and maintenance, but about how the clock felt that week. And when the clock performed perfectly, chiming on the hour with strength and clarity, its hands aligned with the position of the sun, it brought the keeper a quiet sense of pride. Not pride in a boastful sense, but the pride of knowing that something was working as it should, that something was in harmony. And in a world often filled with unpredictability, that small harmony meant a great deal. The townspeople, for their part, rarely saw the keeper at work. They heard his labor in the bell's ring. They trusted the tower to wake them, to guide them, to remind them of appointments and responsibilities. The bell was the town's voice. And while they may have known, vaguely, that someone was behind it all, they did not often stop to think about who. That anonymity was part of the job. The keeper did not work for applause. He worked because the clock needed him. And the clock, in turn, worked for everyone else. It's a chain of care, quiet and constant, passed from one person to another without ceremony. That kind of invisible contribution is easy to overlook, but it is also one of the strongest kinds of service. In some towns, the clock keeper also carried other duties. He might be responsible for maintaining the sundial, or for recording the exact date of the equinox, or for lighting lanterns in the square during dark winter evenings. His work extended beyond the tower, weaving into the daily rituals of town life. Children grew up hearing his footsteps in the tower. Shopkeepers set their hours by his bell. Farmers listened for his chimes to mark when to leave the fields. And when a keeper passed away, it was not uncommon for the town to hold a small ceremony. Not a grand event, but a respectful recognition of years spent in quiet service. His tools would be passed on. His notes would be studied by a new apprentice. And time, as always, would continue. Even today, in some places, the tradition lives on. A few historic towers still employ keepers who maintain old mechanical clocks by hand, not because modern technology demands it, but because people still find meaning in the old ways. Visitors climb the tower steps, hear the gears creak, watch the weights descend inch by inch. They see the dust, the polish marks on the metal, the wear on the wooden stairs, and they realize This is not just a machine. This is a legacy, a heartbeat from another time, still ticking, still cared for, still ringing out across rooftops and cobbled streets as it always has, marking not just the hour, but the passage of countless lives. The passing of time within a town was not always measured in hours or minutes, especially in the centuries before standardization. The town clock, and by extension the clockkeeper, operated in a world where time was a suggestion more than a rule, where the rhythm of daily life was determined as much by sunlight, seasons, and sound as it was by machinery. In this setting, the clockkeeper held a strange and powerful role. He wasn't just measuring time, he was giving it form, shape, and structure. He gave it a voice through the bell and gave it authority through consistency. His work brought order to a world that could otherwise feel loose and uncertain. It's difficult to appreciate this today, when time is displayed on every screen and device within reach, constantly updating itself by the second. But centuries ago, time came in sound and trust. It came in the ring of a bell, the shadow on a dial, the routine presence of a man climbing a tower to do his job without fail. And because of this, people built their lives around him without even realizing it. Consider the daily life of a town that depended on its clock. The bell ringing at 6 in the morning marked the start of the workday. At noon, another chime signaled a pause, a break, a moment of stillness in the middle of effort. Evening brought another bell, reminding everyone of curfew or prayer or rest. This rhythm helped create a sense of unity. A shared time meant shared expectations. You could say, "Meet me at the next bell," and both people would know when and where. You could hear the tone from across a field or through the fog, and it would tether you, however loosely, to the rest of the town. The bell connected people across distance. It marked joy, ringing loudly for weddings, births, and festivals, and it marked grief, sounding low and slow during funerals or national mourning. It became a language, one that everyone understood, even if they never saw the keeper himself. For the clock keeper, this responsibility was both steadying and isolating. There was comfort in the routine, waking early, checking the mechanism, knowing exactly what needed to be done. But there was also solitude. Much of the work was done alone, in silence, high above the streets. He would look down through narrow windows at the rooftops below, hearing distant carts and voices while his hands oiled gears and turned cranks. He became familiar with the birds that nested in the tower, the wind patterns that whistled through the beams, the way light moved through the slats at different times of day. The tower became a private world, suspended above the public one. And yet that solitude gave him a perspective few others had. He watched the town wake and sleep, watched seasons shift, snow gather on rooftops, festivals bloom in the square below, all while tending to the same ancient rhythm, tick, 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 ring. There were moments of crisis too, a frozen mechanism in winter, a rope that snapped, a bell that cracked. And in those moments, the town looked to the keeper not just for repair, but for calm. They trusted him to restore the sound, to bring time back, and he always did. With limited tools, perhaps no formal training, just experience, intuition, and a deep understanding of his craft. These acts of repair were rarely seen, but always felt. A bell that rings on time is easily ignored. A bell that falls silent is missed immediately, and the man who restores it becomes, for a brief moment, visible. Then the rhythm returns, and he disappears back into the tower. Over time, many towns developed customs around the bell. In some places, the number of strikes indicated the hour. In others, special patterns were used for feast days, market days, or even eclipses. The keeper had to memorize all of these. He had to track calendars, adjust times according to shifting daylight, prepare for leap years and local variations. He became part clocksmith, part astronomer, part town historian. Some keepers kept detailed logs of every repair and adjustment. Others left behind only worn tools and a perfectly functioning mechanism. And still, the work endured. The slow persistence of the clock tower is a kind of quiet miracle. Buildings rise and fall, streets change names, populations shift, but the clock remains. Its face fades with time, its gears groan a little more with age, but its presence endures. And for those who know its story, for those who pause beneath its shadow and listen carefully, they might hear more than just the hour. They might hear a whisper of all the days it has seen, of all the lives it has marked, of all the hands that kept it moving through war and peace, through cold and summer, through centuries of unnoticed, unwavering care. As centuries wore on and the face of European towns slowly transformed with the passage of time, the role of the town clock keeper shifted too, though never entirely disappearing. The Industrial Revolution brought with it not only machines and steam, but also a renewed obsession with precision. Suddenly, time had to be exact. Trains had to depart on the minute. Factories required synchronized labor shifts. And with this growing demand for accuracy came the eventual standardization of time zones and the rise of centralized systems. But before radio signals and atomic clocks dictated the ticking of our watches, town clocks still ruled the rhythm of daily life. In small towns and quiet cities where the pace remained unhurried, the clock keeper continued his climb, step by step, up worn staircases, into towers filled with dust and echo and the ever-steady sound of gears turning slowly in their ancient cycles. His work remained rooted in patience. He wound the great weights by hand. He brushed away cobwebs from brass components. He adjusted the pendulum when it shifted off beat by the slimmest margin. In these acts of care, the clock keeper carried something forward, something older than deadlines and mechanical schedules. He kept alive a form of time that was not exact to the second, but deeply human. In many ways, this older sense of timekeeping was more about presence than precision. People didn't ask, "Is it 3:01 or 3:02?" They asked, "Has the bell rung yet?" They lived not by seconds but by sounds. The call to prayer, the end of market, the announcement of curfew. These moments were felt, heard, and trusted. And behind that trust was the keeper. His invisible presence made the town feel anchored. People woke to the same chimes their parents had heard, perhaps even their grandparents. There was comfort in that repetition, in the quiet continuity of life, marked not by screens or alarms but by one man's steady hands and his understanding of how time should move. Some towns even developed a sense of affection for their clock keeper. Children would point up to the tower and whisper stories about the man inside. Vendors in the square might offer him warm bread or fruit as thanks. His face was rarely known to outsiders, but to locals, he was part of the town's identity, an unsung guardian of daily rhythm. He might not attend every celebration or festival, but his bells rang for them. He might not deliver speeches, but his timing shaped the start and end of every town event. Even in silence, he was present. He was part of the fabric of shared experience. As the 19th and 20th centuries progressed, the arrival of electric timekeeping began to push traditional clock mechanisms into disuse. Large municipal clocks were wired to central systems. Winding weights were replaced by motors. Automatic bell ringers took the place of hands pulling ropes, and gradually the need for a human clock keeper diminished. Some keepers retired without replacement. Others stayed on, now more as caretakers of history than essential workers. A few adapted, learning the new systems, continuing to serve in silence, but knowing that something essential had shifted. Time had become impersonal, efficient, but in that efficiency, something was lost. The sound of bells now came from programmed timers, not from a man who had risen early to greet the gears. The tower still stood, but the climb was no longer necessary. And yet, in some places, the tradition resisted. Small towns clung to their keepers, not out of stubbornness, but out of respect. They recognized the poetry in it, the value of a bell rung by hand, of time kept not by circuitry, but by care. These communities understood that the clock was more than a tool. It was a memory, a symbol, a heartbeat made from iron and wood, tended to by someone who understood not just how it worked, but why it mattered. In these towns, the keeper remained. He still climbed, still listened, still paused to check that everything felt right, not just sounded right. He wasn't trying to keep perfect time. He was trying to keep true time. Visitors to these towers, when allowed, often found themselves awed not just by the size of the bell or the complexity of the mechanism, but by the quiet dignity of the person who cared for it. The keeper's workshop might be a small wooden desk tucked into a corner, with a few worn tools and a logbook filled with dates and notes. Nothing grand, nothing flashy. Just a record of time passing kept by a man who rarely asked to be noticed. And yet, in a way, he had shaped the lives of thousands, marked every birth, every funeral, every day in between. So when the bell rings, even now, in some forgotten village at dusk or dawn, remember this: it is not just metal striking metal. It is the echo of centuries, the voice of a town. And somewhere, high in a tower where dust floats in golden light and gears tick softly in rhythm, someone once listened, adjusted, wound, and gave the world a moment of order, of calm, of care, one chime at a time. As timekeeping systems became more advanced and the role of the individual clock keeper began to fade into history, the clock towers themselves remained, standing tall in the centers of towns and cities, their bells still tolling, their faces still looking down upon the streets below. In many cases, the original mechanics were replaced by newer, quieter technology. Motors hummed instead of gears turning. Bell hammers were triggered by timers, not by hand. The keeper's daily climb became a memory, and the quiet ritual of winding the weights slowly disappeared. But despite the modernization of the mechanisms, the soul of these towers persisted. People still looked up. They still paused to listen when the hour struck. They still relied, perhaps unknowingly, on the gentle presence of the tower in the background of their day. The town clock had become something more than a timekeeper. It was now a symbol of tradition, of continuity, of something that outlasted generations. In towns that kept their original clock mechanisms alive, often through restoration efforts or passionate local volunteers, a new type of keeper emerged: the preservationist. These were not always descendants of the old clock keepers, but they shared the same reverence for the machinery, the same patience for the task. They learned how to wind by hand. They studied diagrams drawn centuries ago. They sourced or even handcrafted missing parts. And in doing so, they bridged past and present, not through words, but through movement, through care, through attention. Tourists visiting these towers sometimes watched in quiet fascination as the keeper demonstrated how the clock worked, showing them the heavy counterweights, the escapement mechanism, the carefully balanced pendulum. The process wasn't fast or flashy. It was slow, precise, deliberate. And that's exactly what made it beautiful. In a world of instant information and rapid change, watching someone take 10 minutes just to wind a clock felt like witnessing something sacred. Even in towns where the original mechanisms were gone, the story of the clock keeper was still remembered. Local museums displayed his tools. Schools taught students about how time used to be kept before satellites and apps. Plaques were placed at the base of towers, honoring names long forgotten by history books, but deeply respected by the communities they served. People understood, even if only vaguely, that the passage of time itself had once depended on the hands and habits of someone who climbed those stairs each day without fail. And that recognition carried weight. It gave the clock face a kind of personality. It made the bell feel like a voice, not just a sound. In some rare places, the old traditions returned in small ways. A town council might decide to appoint an honorary clock keeper, not because it was needed, but because it felt right. Perhaps someone with knowledge of mechanics, or simply a love of history. Their role was ceremonial, perhaps. Or perhaps it was something more, a way of reminding the town that some things are worth caring for. That not every job needs to be efficient or profitable to be meaningful. That sometimes the act of climbing the stairs and winding the clock is its own reward, a gesture of respect to those who came before and a gift to those yet to come. Meanwhile, the architecture of the towers continued to stand as silent storytellers. The bricks and mortar, the wooden stairs smoothed by centuries of footsteps. The dusty beams above which pigeons roosted. The ropes once tugged by human hands, all of it remained. A visitor stepping inside might feel the hush immediately, the sense that this was not just a room filled with machinery, but a space where time itself had gathered, coiled, and stretched over the years. In some towers, you can still see hand-painted numbers on the wall, marking calibration points from centuries ago. You can see initials carved into beams by long-gone keepers. Even the smell, wood, oil, old iron, and age is something distinct, something that cannot be replicated. And if you listen closely, in those quiet towers, you may still hear it. The soft tick of the escapement, the groan of the weight beginning to descend, the faintest creak of a gear adjusting under tension. It's not the loud clang of the bell that holds the magic, but the silence around it, the expectation, the preparation, the waiting. Time, in its most ancient form, is not just sound or number, it's presence. The clockkeeper understood this better than most. His job was not just to mark time, but to honor it, to hold space for it, to let it move as it always has, quietly, steadily, patiently, one tick at a time. While the world continued to evolve, modernizing, urbanizing, digitizing, the ancient clock towers that once defined the rhythm of town life remained as quiet reminders of a time when the measurement of hours was something tactile, earned, and tended to with care. The role of the town clockkeeper may no longer be essential in most places, but the story of that role continues to echo, not just through restored gears and ringing bells, but through the culture and memory of the towns themselves. In some communities, annual festivals or heritage days are held in honor of the clock tower and its keepers. Children learn about the history of the town not from textbooks, but from climbing the narrow staircases of those towers, placing their hands on iron railings smoothed by generations before them. They listen to stories told by local elders or historical guides, tales of storms weathered, of clocks stopped during war, of bells muffled in mourning or rung with joy at peace. These stories, passed along with reverence, keep the memory of the keepers alive. Clock towers are often built to last, but they still require care. Without attention, even the strongest mechanisms fall silent. That's why preservation work is ongoing in many places, often led not by governments, but by volunteers, local historians, and craftspeople with a passion for the old ways. They raise funds to restore rusted gears, replace cracked bell frames, and reconstruct winding systems that were abandoned long ago. It's painstaking work. It requires research, precision, and above all, time. But the people who do it understand something fundamental. This is not about nostalgia. It's about stewardship, about honoring the past while creating a meaningful connection to the present. Because when a bell rings again after years of silence, it doesn't just mark the hour, it marks a return, a reawakening, a continuation of something once thought lost. The emotional weight of the clock tower is difficult to describe, but universally felt. Whether in a small alpine village, a coastal town in England, or a historic square in southern Italy, the sight of the tower evokes something ancient and grounding. It anchors the town, it orients the people within it. Even if the time it tells is no longer essential to daily function, it offers a sense of familiarity, of presence. People might glance at their phones to check the hour, but they still listen for the bell. And when it rings, they don't measure its accuracy. They simply notice it. They feel it. It reminds them they're home. In this way, the clockkeeper's legacy is not just mechanical or historical, it's emotional. He was the caretaker of a rhythm, not a tempo defined by speed, but one defined by consistency. He represented a kind of reliability that is increasingly rare in the modern world. As schedules become chaotic and days blur together, the old clock tower offers a different message, one of patience, of persistence, of care repeated daily, not for praise, but because it matters, because people depend on it, even if they forget to say so. And so the clockkeeper became a kind of quiet philosopher. He understood time not as numbers or deadlines, but as experience. He measured not just the passing of minutes, but the shape of days. He felt the way mornings stretched longer in winter, the way summer afternoons grew lazy and golden. He knew when the gears strained under the weight of humidity, or when the cold made the bell ring sharper and clearer. These observations, though never written into ledgers or manuals, became part of his understanding, an understanding passed on by doing, by noticing, by showing up day after day, year after year. In the stories that remain, one can find fragments of real people behind the role. A keeper who rang the bell by hand during a snowstorm when the mechanism froze. Another who carved his initials discreetly into the wooden beam near the bell as a quiet mark of presence. Some wrote poems in their notebooks. Others left behind detailed repair journals. A few lived alone in the tower, a small cot beside the mechanism, a single lantern their companion during long, dark nights. And yet none of them asked to be remembered. They did their work in the background, and in that way, they became part of the structure itself, part of the town's breath, part of the passing of time. And that is perhaps the most beautiful truth of all, that the work of the clockkeeper was never really about the hours or the chimes or the mechanics. It was about connection. The keeper was connected to the machine to the bell to the people to each other. all held together by rhythm. A rhythm that pulsed softly through the heart of the town, not always noticed, but always there, waiting, ticking, ringing. As night fell over the town and the streets emptied into stillness, the tower stood as it always had, tall, unmoving, quietly observant. For centuries, this was the moment when the work of the clockkeeper felt most profound. With the bustle of the day gone and the world below settling into sleep, he would make his final climb of the evening. The sound of his footsteps on stone, the soft creak of the wooden trapdoor, and the faint tick of the mechanism were the only noises that accompanied him. There was no crowd to witness his work, no one to applaud the precision with which he checked the pendulum's swing or rebalanced a weight. But in that solitude, something meaningful took place. A meeting between man and machine, between past and present, between silence and sound. The keeper understood the importance of this quiet ritual, not because it was grand, but because it was consistent. In a world that constantly changed, this was something that did not, a task that still mattered, a duty carried out with the same care as those before him, and those who would follow. In earlier centuries, the night was marked not just by darkness, but by danger. Before electric streetlights and 24-hour cities, nighttime held a very different character. People stayed indoors, streets were dimly lit, if at all. And yet the town's clock kept time through it all, ringing in the deep hours of the night, not for activity, but for reassurance. Even if no one was awake to hear it, the bell rang. The rhythm continued. The keeper ensured that this rhythm did not falter, even if no one noticed. That was part of the calling, to keep time, even when the world was sleeping, to hold a place for continuity when everything else slowed to a whisper. And so he did, faithfully, without fail, for years on end. In some towns, the keeper would light a lantern in the tower window as a sign that the mechanism had been wound and all was well. That single flicker of warm light high above the rooftops became a symbol, a message to the townspeople that someone was watching, that someone was still tending the heartbeat of the town. It brought comfort, even if few ever saw the keeper face to face. It was enough to know he was there, that in the silence of night, there was still motion, still care, still time. Many clock keepers found deep personal meaning in their work. For some, it was a family trade. For others, it was a quiet calling discovered in youth and held through old age. Few careers required such patience, such attentiveness, such unbroken dedication to routine. And yet, in the simplicity of it, many found peace. The world outside might grow loud, confusing, even frightening, but the clock remained a space of order, of focus, a mechanism that, while complex, obeyed laws that never changed. It rewarded gentle attention and punished neglect. And so the keeper learned to listen, not just with ears, but with intuition. He sensed shifts before they became problems. He knew how long a repair would take just by watching the way a gear turned. It was not just maintenance, it was a relationship. As the decades turned into centuries, the names of individual keepers may have faded, but the traces of their lives remain. An old oil can left in a corner, a broom worn to the handle, a penciled note tucked into a crevice with a date and a name, March 12, 1824, adjusted the chime by 2 seconds. These artifacts are not grand or impressive, but they are human. They remind us that history is not just about kings and battles and inventions. It is also about the people who showed up each day to do their work with quiet pride. The clock keeper was one of those people, invisible perhaps, but foundational. Today, those who visit historic towers often find themselves overwhelmed not by the scale of the machinery, but by the feeling it carries. The feeling that time has passed through here, slowly, steadily, respectfully. That hands long gone once turned these same levers. That someone once paused to look out the same narrow window and watch the same square below, filled with lanterns or snow or laughter or stillness. And for a moment, standing there, the visitor is part of that same story, linked not by technology or language, but by time itself. So when the bell sounds again, whether it's a deep chime at midnight or a warm peal at noon, let it be more than just background noise. Let it be a memory, a gesture, a thread between now and then. And let it remind you that somewhere in the past, someone climbed the tower, checked the gears, and made sure the town would know what time it was, not because they had to, but because they believed it mattered. There is something quietly noble about dedicating a life to something that rarely earns recognition, to a task that most people never fully understand but instinctively trust. The town clock keeper was never the face of a city, never elected or widely celebrated, but his presence shaped the lives of everyone around him. His influence was not loud. It was measured in minutes that aligned, in bells that rang exactly when they should, in the comfort people felt knowing that someone was watching over time itself. In an age where time is measured digitally, displayed in glowing numbers on walls, phones, and wrists, it's easy to forget how much physicality used to be required to make time visible and reliable. Before there were satellites and servers, there were gears, weights, and a man who climbed a tower every day, not to be seen or praised, but because the clock needed him, and the people needed the clock. This quiet interdependence formed the heartbeat of communities for centuries. The tools of the clock keeper were simple by today's standards. Oil for lubrication, cloths for wiping dust from delicate cogs, winding cranks for pulling heavy counterweights back into position, and handwritten logs noting every adjustment. These tools, though ordinary, were handled with a kind of reverence. They connected the keeper not only to the machine in his care, but to every other keeper who had stood in the same space before him. In some towers, the same winding handle had been used for 200 years. The same wooden stool sat beside the same wooden bench where generations of hands had repaired the same stubborn gear. Each scratch in the wood, each mark on the floor, each fingerprint left in the dust told a story of someone who had shown up again and again, through all kinds of weather, through personal hardship and local celebration alike, to keep the town in rhythm. Many towers had peculiar quirks, slight imperfections in their construction that the keeper came to know intimately. Perhaps the north-facing wall let in more cold wind, making winter adjustments more difficult. Perhaps one gear always ran a bit faster than the others and had to be accounted for manually. These quirks made each clock unique, not just as machines, but as characters. The keeper didn't simply operate a device, he cared for a companion. And as with all long-standing relationships, the longer he worked with the clock, the more attuned he became to its moods. A faint rattle in the mechanism might have meant a loose pin. A slightly slower chime might have pointed to dust buildup or worn ropes. He learned to fix problems before they became failures, to anticipate the needs of a system built long before he was born, and which would, in all likelihood, continue long after he was gone. The daily climb up the tower's narrow staircase became more than routine. It became ritual. Some keepers marked the steps as they climbed, whispering small reflections, offering thanks or simply listening to their breath against the cold stone. Others carried a small lantern or candle before electricity was introduced. Their path lit only by flickering light and memory, the air grew colder the higher they went. The sounds of the town faded away. At the top, the city felt distant, almost like a memory. It was just the keeper and the clock, just the quiet and the steady tick-tick-tick of the gears waiting for attention. The room held a kind of sacred stillness. No matter how noisy the world became outside, this space remained untouched. It was a chamber of care, of continuation. Sometimes, the keeper would pause at the tower's window before heading back down. He would look over the rooftops of the town, watching smoke rise from chimneys, children running through cobbled streets, horses pulling carts through muddy alleys. He would know that the people down below rarely thought of the tower during the day, but that they would notice if the bell failed to ring. He was okay with that. There was comfort in being trusted, even if unseen. He didn't need praise. His satisfaction came in the form of consistency, in knowing that people relied on the sound he helped maintain, that life moved more smoothly because of his quiet work. And so, year after year, decade after decade, the keepers came and went. They left behind nothing flashy, no monuments or famous books, just clocks that worked, bells that rang, logs in faded ink, dusty workshops and winding staircases. They gave their time to time itself, and in doing so, they became part of something larger, something that didn't need to shout to be heard, something that kept the world moving, gently, faithfully, 1 hour at a time. As we reach the end of this quiet journey through the life and legacy of the town clock keeper, what lingers most is not the machinery, nor the tower itself, but the rhythm. The rhythm of time, yes, but also the rhythm of care, of trust, of silent labor repeated without praise. The keeper's task was never about grandeur. He did not seek to change the world. Instead, he ensured the world could continue in its daily flow, uninterrupted, measured, familiar. In the small towns where his presence once defined the pace of life, the traces of his work remain, not only in restored clock faces or ticking gears, but in the collective memory of communities that once moved to the sound of his bell. The town square still sits in the shadow of the tower. The rooftops still reflect the light from its windows. And somewhere within the structure, often tucked away behind beams and stone, the old mechanism waits. Some still functional, others preserved like museum pieces, each a testament to the hands that once kept it alive. There's something deeply human about the work of the clockkeeper. It asks for no glory, promises no fortune, and requires a devotion that most would find too quiet, too slow. But in that slowness, in that unwavering patience, lies its meaning. The keeper's attention to detail, his instinct for the machine's needs, his commitment to winding and checking and cleaning, all of it speaks to a different kind of strength. A strength not of dominance, but of stewardship. He did not force time to obey him. He served it, aligned himself with its demands, allowed his life to bend around the rhythm of the hour, the movement of the gear, the weight of the bell. And in doing so, he became not just the keeper of the clock, but a living part of it. In today's world, time feels different. It rushes forward. It flashes on screens, buzzes in pockets, interrupts our moments with constant alerts. We rarely consider the source of the time we check. We just assume it will be there, correct to the second, synchronized across the globe. But once, time had to be earned. It had to be tended, adjusted, respected. The clockkeeper understood this. He did not chase time. He shaped it gently, held it in balance, allowed it to speak through the bell that echoed across the rooftops. His was a kind of invisible artistry, one that asked for stillness, for listening, for care. The legacy of the clockkeeper is not only mechanical or historical, it is philosophical. It invites us to reconsider how we experience time. What would it mean to slow down, to listen for the rhythm in our own days, to approach our work, whatever it may be, with the same quiet reverence? Perhaps it is not so much about restoring old clocks as it is about restoring old values. Devotion, craftsmanship, the belief that even unnoticed work can hold immense worth, that showing up each day without fanfare can be a kind of heroism. In some places today, the bells still ring out from ancient towers, sometimes automated, sometimes not. Few pause to wonder who maintains them. Fewer still know the stories of those who once did. But if you ever find yourself beneath one of these towers, and you hear the bell chime above you, take a moment, let it wash over you, not as a sound that marks the hour, but as a sound that connects you to the past. To the people who lived their lives in the rhythm of that bell, to the keeper who wound it each day, to the time that moved just a little slower and perhaps a little more meaningfully. Let the tower remind you that some things are worth preserving, not because they're fast or efficient or profitable, but because they carry stories, because they hold the spirit of care, and because they teach us that time, at its best, is not about counting seconds. It's about how we live within them. So here, at the quiet conclusion of this story, we leave behind the tower, not in haste, but with gratitude. We thank the unseen keepers who gave their lives to something steady and true. We thank the bells that marked not just hours, but history. And we carry forward the lesson they offer. That time, when honored, becomes more than a measure. It becomes a memory, a rhythm, a way to move gently through the world, one faithful chime at a time. That brings us to the end of the story. If you've made it this far, gently resting or still listening, may I kindly ask for a like and a quiet little subscribe? It truly helps us continue bringing you calm stories like this, night after night. Now let's continue our journey through the quiet corners of the past, with the next sleepy chapter in our series, The Rise of Medieval Libraries. Close your eyes, let your thoughts slow down, and let's drift into a time when books were rare and silence sacred. Before libraries became the public institutions we know today, open to all, brightly lit, and filled with printed books available in endless copies, they were something far rarer and far more mysterious. In the medieval world, books were not common, they were not cheap, they were not mass-produced. Each one was made by hand, slowly over months or even years, by scribes who copied every word with careful attention. The rise of medieval libraries was not a fast or sudden transformation, but a gradual, quiet shift that reflected changing values, deeper learning, and the growing belief that knowledge, like gold or land, was worth preserving. These early libraries were often hidden behind stone walls, lit by candlelight, and guarded by rules that seem foreign to us now. But within those quiet chambers, history was being written, word by word, binding by binding, shelf by shelf. The earliest medieval libraries were typically connected to religious institutions. Monasteries, abbeys, and cathedral schools served as the primary centers of learning during the early Middle Ages, especially in the centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In a time when much of Europe had fractured into smaller kingdoms and literacy was no longer widespread, monks became the stewards of knowledge. They copied classical texts, sacred scripture, commentaries, and medical treatises, preserving the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome alongside their own theological works. These texts were stored in what was sometimes called the armarium, a cupboard or small room near the cloister or scriptorium. At first, libraries consisted of just a few shelves. A dozen books might represent a substantial collection. But even in those early days, there was a sense that books were treasures, objects not just to be used, but to be respected, guarded, and passed down. As monastic life became more organized under orders like the Benedictines and Cistercians, so too did the systems of storing and accessing books. Rules were established to govern who could use the texts, how they could be handled, and where they must be returned. Some monasteries chained books to desks to prevent theft, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. A single book might take a year to copy and bind. The parchment used for pages came from animal skins, scraped and treated. The inks were hand-mixed from minerals and plant extracts. The covers were made of wood, wrapped in leather, and often reinforced with clasps. In other words, every book was a physical investment, a labor of care. And because of this, libraries were not casual places, they were sanctuaries. These early collections were typically arranged by subject, not by author or title. Theology was often placed near the front. Philosophy and logic followed. Grammar, rhetoric, medicine, and law came after. Each book might be cataloged in a handwritten register, an early version of a library index. The librarian, often a senior monk, was responsible for knowing the location of each volume and ensuring it was returned in the same condition in which it had been borrowed. Silence was enforced not just as a rule of decorum, but as a sign of respect for the words on the page and for the hours it had taken to place them there. Over time, as cathedral schools grew and universities began to emerge in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, the need for more accessible collections of texts expanded. Students required materials for study, teachers needed references, and with that demand came the growth of institutional libraries beyond monastic walls. These university libraries were often small at first, usually a single room or upper chamber near the lecture halls. Books were still rare, still handwritten, still precious. But now they were being used not only by monks, but by students, scholars, and traveling lecturers. The library became a place of intellectual exchange, not loud or busy, but alive with thought. The transition from purely religious texts to secular knowledge was slow and subtle. Theology remained central, but works of natural philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and even poetry began to take up space on the shelves. Many of these texts were copied from Arabic and Greek sources, translated in centers like Toledo or Palermo, where cultures intersected and ideas flowed across language barriers. As these works entered the Latin West, they brought with them new curiosity, and the libraries grew accordingly, not just in number, but in purpose. By the end of the 12th century, some of the more prominent libraries might have held several hundred volumes, a staggering number for the time. Still, these spaces were not open to the public. One needed permission, training, and in many cases, affiliation with a religious or educational institution to even view the collection. But even in their exclusivity, these libraries represented something remarkable: the idea that knowledge should be preserved, that it mattered enough to be written, protected, and shared, even if slowly and even if only among a few. As the medieval world moved deeper into the 12th and 13th centuries, libraries began to evolve, not only in size, but in spirit. The quiet cupboards of monastic life and the modest shelves of cathedral schools were slowly transforming into structured, purposeful spaces that supported an emerging intellectual culture. The university, still young in its institutional form, played a central role in this transformation. Where earlier libraries had been curated almost exclusively by monks for monks, these new academic libraries served a different audience: students, lecturers, scholars, and scribes. Men whose lives revolved around inquiry, discourse, and the pursuit of understanding. In cities like Paris and Bologna, where university life was vibrant and rapidly growing, the library became not just a storage room for sacred texts, but an engine of learning, a kind of intellectual hearth where the embers of ancient knowledge were carefully tended and occasionally fanned into flame. Books in these libraries remained chained to reading desks, not out of distrust, but to ensure that they remained available to all who needed them. In an age before printing, when every volume was copied by hand and could cost the equivalent of several months of labor, each book was a significant communal investment. Libraries served not individuals, but communities of scholars, each one borrowing from a common well of learning. The chains allowed for shared access, without the risk of loss, creating a curious blend of openness and protection. Reading was done in silence. Pages were turned slowly. The margins of the manuscripts were often filled with careful notes, glosses, and commentaries that added layers of thought to the words themselves. These marginalia were not acts of defacement, but of dialogue, a way for the reader to speak back to the text, to question it, expand on it, or record a flash of insight. Over time, some books became so layered with such notes that they represented not only the original work, but the evolving conversation that had grown up around it. The custodians of these libraries, often known as custodes librorum or armari, were more than just keepers of the keys. They were stewards of intellectual tradition. Their role involved cataloging texts, overseeing loans, maintaining inventories, and often repairing damaged volumes. Many were scholars themselves, trained in Latin, theology, and the practical skills of manuscript care. Their work was meticulous. If a book was damaged, the parchment might need to be rescraped, the ink reapplied, the binding restitched. These acts of preservation were done not for profit, but out of a deep reverence for the text. To save a book was to save a voice, a lineage of thought, a thread in the great tapestry of human understanding. While access remained restricted to members of the institution, the libraries of this period were slowly becoming more systematic. Some adopted early versions of shelf marks and cataloging systems, using letters and numbers to identify books and their contents. Others maintained detailed inventories and codices that could be consulted by scholars looking for specific works. These were not public card catalogs as we know them today, but they represented the first stirrings of organized information management. The idea that knowledge should not just be stored, but arranged, labeled, and made accessible to those who sought it was beginning to take shape. As literacy expanded among the clergy and educated classes, the appetite for books also grew. New scriptoria were established to meet demand, often operating within monastic settings, but increasingly serving outside patrons, bishops, noblemen, lawyers, and professors. The act of copying a book remained slow and expensive, but more scribes meant more books, and more books meant larger libraries. This expansion was uneven, of course. While some institutions boasted collections of several hundred manuscripts, many others still managed with a few dozen. But the direction was clear. The preservation and distribution of written knowledge was becoming a cultural priority. The subjects of the text also continued to broaden. Theology remained dominant, but legal texts, scientific treatises, and even works of classical literature began to gain ground. Aristotle, long unknown in the Latin West, was reintroduced through Arabic translations and Latin commentaries. His works on logic, ethics, and natural philosophy became foundational to the scholastic method and were soon found on the shelves of nearly every major university library. Alongside him came Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, voices from the ancient world revived by the careful hands of translators and the scribes who gave those voices new bodies on fresh pages of vellum. And so, across generations, the medieval library grew, not in haste, but steadily. Each book copied was a small miracle of patience. Each shelf added was a quiet statement of belief, that words mattered, that ideas endured, and that knowledge deserved to be preserved, not only for the scholar of today, but for the reader of tomorrow, whoever they might be. As the 14th century approached, the concept of the library began to extend beyond monastic walls and university halls. While religious and academic institutions remained the primary custodians of books, the growing influence of urban centers and the gradual rise of literacy among the educated, lay population began to shift the cultural landscape. Cities like Florence, Avignon, and Prague became not only political or commercial centers, but intellectual ones as well. Wealthy individuals, clergy, merchants, physicians, and court officials began to assemble private collections of manuscripts, creating small libraries within their own homes or chapels. These were not public libraries in the modern sense, but their existence marked a meaningful evolution in the relationship between people and books. The library was no longer just a monastic duty, it was becoming a mark of personal refinement, education, and status. The manuscripts collected in these private libraries varied widely. Religious texts, of course, were still foundational: psalters, books of hours, commentaries, and devotional works. But increasingly, secular knowledge found a place on the shelves: Latin translations of Aristotle, medical texts from Salerno, collections of Roman law, treatises on astronomy, guides to rhetoric, and works of classical history were all in circulation among those who could afford them. Some even collected poetry and romance literature, courtly tales, or moral fables, texts not strictly necessary for religious life or university study, but valued for their beauty, their reflection on human nature, or their role in social discourse. These private collectors often worked with scribes or book dealers, commissioning copies of manuscripts they had seen elsewhere, or requesting custom bindings and illuminations. In this way, a new kind of book culture began to emerge, one that combined devotion, scholarship, and aesthetic appreciation. The aesthetic dimension of medieval books deserves attention, for it tells us much about how libraries were regarded. Many manuscripts were richly illuminated, their margins adorned with intricate patterns, miniature scenes, or symbolic figures. Gold leaf was used to make titles gleam. Deep blues and reds were favored for their richness, derived from costly minerals like lapis lazuli or cinnabar. The binding of a book was often as carefully considered as the content within it. Leather, wood, horn, and even ivory were used to create durable and beautiful covers. Clasps were added to keep the pages tightly closed, protecting them from moisture and dust. The more elaborate the book, the more likely it was to be stored carefully, read with reverence, and passed down through generations. These were not disposable objects. They were heirlooms of thought. Within larger institutions, library spaces themselves began to change. Rooms were constructed with greater attention to layout and security. Desks were built to accommodate multiple chained books at once. Windows were placed high to provide light without encouraging theft or distraction. In some cases, the architecture of the library became a point of pride, symbolic of the institution's intellectual weight. And though the libraries were still primarily closed to the public, they were no longer entirely hidden. Visitors might be granted access by request. Scholars might come from abroad to study specific manuscripts. A sense of the library as a repository not just of books, but of cultural memory began to take hold. Meanwhile, outside these scholarly and private spheres, a quieter revolution was taking place. Professional scribes, often trained in urban workshops, began copying texts for sale. These book producers, sometimes operating in teams, helped meet the growing demand for manuscripts among both institutions and individuals. The quality varied. Some were elegantly crafted, others more functional, but the sheer increase in volume marked a significant change. Book ownership, once limited to institutions or the nobility, was slowly expanding. The idea that a person might possess a small library of their own, a handful of volumes kept in a chest or cabinet, was no longer unthinkable. By the late medieval period, the cataloging of books had become more standardized. Librarians recorded not only titles, but authors, subjects, and formats. Some began using rudimentary classification systems, grouping texts by discipline and recording their shelf location. In larger libraries, these systems were copied and updated over generations, forming early blueprints for the organizational systems of modern libraries. These were slow, manual processes, but they represented a growing awareness that knowledge could not only be preserved, but structured, made easier to find, to access, to share. And so, book by book, shelf by shelf, the medieval library continued to grow, its walls thick with the weight of parchment, its halls lined with words written in quiet hours by candlelight. It was not loud, not fast, not accessible to all, but it was steadfast. It endured because people believed in what it held. Not just pages, but ideas. Not just ink, but memory. And in that belief, the foundation was laid for what libraries would eventually become. Places where knowledge is not hoarded, but offered. Where learning is not exclusive, but shared. And where silence is not emptiness, but respect for the words waiting to be read. By the early 15th century, the presence of libraries in urban life had grown noticeably. While still limited to the privileged classes, the quiet accumulation of books in both institutional and private settings had begun to shift how knowledge was preserved and accessed. Large cathedral schools and emerging universities developed more structured library rooms, often housing several hundred volumes by this time, a number that would have been unthinkable only a century earlier. These collections reflected a broadening intellectual appetite, not just theology and canon law, but increasingly philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and the natural sciences. Manuscripts in Latin remained dominant, but vernacular texts began appearing more frequently, especially in regions where local language literature had gained ground. This linguistic shift was subtle but meaningful. It meant that the library was beginning, however slowly, to look outward, to invite new voices into its quiet order. In some cities, libraries were built as architectural statements. The Laurentian Library in Florence, designed later by Michelangelo, had its roots in this period, though it would not be completed until the 16th century. Other spaces were more modest, rooms above chapels, narrow corridors beside cloisters, or even entire buildings set aside for scholarly work. These libraries were often carefully constructed for both preservation and purpose. Windows were small and placed high to reduce moisture. Shelving was built into the walls, sometimes with benches below for reading. Some libraries used lecterns with chained books to prevent theft, though these chains were not only practical, but symbolic. They reflected a world in which books were treasures, each one precious, irreplaceable, and deeply vulnerable. To protect these growing collections, librarians began developing systems of record-keeping, more sophisticated than simple inventories. Some catalogs listed works by author, others by subject, others by format. Indexes were created with cross-references, and shelving was sometimes arranged by discipline. In a few libraries, symbols were added to the spines of books. Early efforts at what we might now call spine labeling. These innovations were not uniform across Europe, but they signaled a shared problem: how to organize an ever-expanding body of knowledge. The answers were often local, rooted in the habits of a particular librarian or institution, but together they formed a quiet chorus, a shared determination to give structure to the act of reading. Outside the library walls, the world was changing. The late medieval period was a time of social transformation, the rise of merchant classes, the slow decline of feudal structures, and the growth of cities. Along with these changes came a new kind of reader, laypeople who had received some education, merchants, notaries, minor nobles, began to seek out books for personal use. This might be a book of hours, richly decorated and used for daily prayer, or a medical treatise, useful in trade. It might be a romance written in French or Italian, or a practical guide to business and accounting. These readers did not call themselves scholars, but they were shaping a new literary culture. The library was no longer only a place for monks or masters, but increasingly for minds shaped by the rhythms of commerce and civic life. The production of manuscripts to meet this demand remained laborious, but by this point had become more professional. Urban scriptoria, teams of scribes and illuminators, operated in cities like Paris, Bruges, and Bologna. Clients could commission copies of specific texts, request certain decorations, or choose between parchment and the newer paper, which had begun to spread across Europe from Islamic Spain. Paper was cheaper and lighter than parchment, and though some still viewed it as inferior, it allowed more books to be made and sold. This quiet shift in materials, like the shift in language, would help pave the way for the massive changes still to come. And yet, amid all these developments, libraries remained places of stillness. They were not public in the modern sense. There were no opening hours posted on doors, no library cards, no borrowing. Access was by permission, and many books could not be removed from the premises. But for those allowed inside, the library offered something powerful: silence, time, and the promise of preserved thought. A reader might spend hours copying a passage by hand, or simply tracing the lines of illuminated letters with tired eyes. There was no rush, no clicking clocks, only the hush of turning pages, and the quiet knowledge that here, in these shelves, the past was waiting. As the 15th century unfolded, the quiet work of copying, storing, and organizing texts began to prepare the stage for one of the most transformative inventions in human history. The printing press had not yet arrived, but the conditions that would make it revolutionary were already being quietly constructed inside the stone walls of medieval libraries. The people who worked in these spaces, scribes, librarians, clerics, students, could not have known what was coming, but their devotion to preservation was laying the groundwork for something much larger. They were the stewards of a slow knowledge, one page at a time. Some libraries began forming partnerships with scholars or wealthy patrons to fund specific book projects. These might include multi-volume theological commentaries, legal digests, or new translations of classical works recently rediscovered in the growing humanist movement. As these projects expanded, so too did the ambition of the libraries themselves. No longer content with a small shelf of volumes chained to a wall, libraries began imagining themselves as repositories of entire disciplines. Some institutions even recorded their ambitions in writing, outlining which authors and subjects they intended to collect. These early collection policies hinted at a broader vision, a belief that the library could become a mirror of the world's thought. This expansion also brought challenges. The sheer weight of the books, the need for space, the difficulty of cataloging works written by authors with similar names or identical titles. These problems pressed on the minds of medieval librarians. But perhaps the most pressing issue was time. Every book took weeks or months to create. A single mistake could require hours of correction, and many scribes had to copy texts in poor lighting, in cold rooms, with ink that could freeze in winter. Errors crept in, marginalia multiplied, and yet the work continued. In some cases, older texts were scraped clean to reuse the parchment, creating palimpsests, ghost texts where the original writing faintly survived beneath the newer script. These erased layers tell a quiet story of scarcity, of reuse, and of what a society chooses to keep or forget. And still the shelves grew. As libraries expanded, so did the expectations of their users. University students, often young men from wealthy families, arrived with an increasing sense of what books could do, not just preserve theology, but explore medicine, logic, astronomy, ethics. In some towns, libraries began keeping copies of textbooks in designated reading rooms, with notes in the margins left by generations of students. These notes were often more than academic. They included jokes, prayers, sketches, and small reminders that these vast walls of books were being read by real people, with real questions and real fatigue. One such note, scribbled into a manuscript in Paris, reads simply, "Thank God, it is finished." A moment of honest relief, buried inside the bindings of a book that took months to produce. There was a kind of community in these libraries, silent and indirect, but strong. A student in Bologna might read a book copied in Cologne. A teacher in Oxford might request a transcription from a library in Avignon. Though the roads between these cities were long and dangerous, ideas began to travel through the careful hands of messengers and scribes. The physical book was the vehicle, but the library was the harbor. It kept the vessel safe between voyages. And so, even as war and plague periodically swept through towns, even as political leaders rose and fell, the libraries endured. They were not immune to destruction. Many were looted or burned over the centuries. But the idea of the library persisted, quietly resilient. By the end of the 15th century, rumors of a new kind of book were spreading. Books that did not require a scribe, books that could be printed by machine. At first, these were viewed with suspicion. Could a machine truly replicate the artistry of the hand? Could it be trusted to preserve meaning? Some believed it was dangerous, even heretical, but others, especially younger scholars, saw potential. If books could be copied quickly and more cheaply, then libraries could grow in ways no one had imagined. Knowledge might finally reach beyond the cloister. The world, it seemed, was on the edge of something new. But inside the stone rooms of the old libraries, the lamps still burned low, the scribes still dipped their pens in ink, and the silence still held. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century most notably by Johannes Gutenberg, did not immediately replace the old library system. In fact, for many years, the world of handwritten manuscripts and the world of printed books coexisted side by side. At first, printed books tried to resemble manuscripts in every possible way. Early printers mimicked the fonts, the illuminated letters, the spacing, and even left blank spaces for artists to later hand-paint decorative elements. It was not yet clear that the printed book would become dominant, and so printers courted the tastes of the old world, seeking the approval of institutions that had long favored beauty, precision, and tradition. Many monastic libraries hesitated to accept the new printed works. They questioned the durability of the materials, the lack of hand-checked accuracy, and the absence of sacred labor involved in creating them. But the benefits were impossible to ignore. What once took a scribe several months could now be produced in mere days. What once required parchment from dozens of animals could now be printed on cheaper, more available paper. And most importantly, a single work could now exist in dozens, even hundreds, of identical copies, with no loss of detail or drift in meaning. This was revolutionary. Libraries across Europe began to shift. Some divided their collections into two parts: the old manuscripts, usually still chained, and the new printed books, often stored in locked cabinets or boxes. Others embraced the press entirely, auctioning off older duplicates or donating them to smaller institutions. The cataloging systems had to evolve quickly. Librarians developed new classification schemes, using letters and numbers to organize growing inventories. What had once been a collection of 200 volumes could now grow to 2,000 in just a few decades. This rapid expansion brought joy and confusion in equal measure. Patrons marveled at the variety of available texts, but finding a specific work became more difficult. To help, libraries began producing printed catalogs, books about books, so that scholars could locate what they needed before ever visiting the shelves. Some of these catalogs survive to this day, offering a glimpse into what knowledge was deemed essential at the time. With the rise of printing, libraries also became more public in nature. While many remained attached to religious institutions, others began opening their doors to citizens, scholars, merchants, and eventually the general public. Reading rooms grew larger, with long benches and writing desks under tall windows. Rules were posted on walls. Silence must be maintained. Books must not be taken outside. No inkpots on the reading tables. There was a seriousness to these places, a reverence for learning that bordered on the sacred. And yet they were not empty halls of quiet solemnity. These libraries buzzed softly with the turning of pages, the scratching of pens, and the quiet hum of shared curiosity. In many cities, the library became a destination not just for study, but for wonder. In Florence, Cosimo de' Medici funded one of the first truly public libraries, housed in the Dominican convent of San Marco. The architecture was spacious, filled with light, and the collection was curated to reflect both classical wisdom and Christian teaching. It was a place of beauty and balance. In England, Richard de Bury's treatise Philobiblon praised the love of books with near poetic devotion, suggesting that no treasure was more precious than knowledge shared. In Paris, the Sorbonne Library expanded rapidly, building specialized rooms for law, medicine, theology, and the liberal arts. Each city had its own approach, but the pattern was clear. Libraries were no longer only for the elite or the ordained. They were becoming tools for cities to educate themselves, to preserve their identity, and to look forward. But this evolution also raised new concerns. With more books in more hands, who would guard against errors? Who would decide what was worth preserving? The quiet power of the librarian became more important than ever. No longer just caretakers of pages, they became curators of knowledge itself, choosing, organizing, sometimes even censoring what would be passed down. In some places, especially during times of political upheaval or religious tension, books were burned. In others, they were hidden, sealed behind walls, or locked away in forbidden rooms. The story of the library was no longer just about the spread of knowledge. It was also about control, about memory, and about who would be allowed to shape the story of the world. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the very idea of a library continued to evolve. What had once been dim, cloistered chambers in the corners of monasteries were now taking on entirely new architectural forms. Cities that aspired to cultural greatness invested in the creation of large, purpose-built library buildings. These were often funded by noble families, civic institutions, or learned societies that believed deeply in the value of public knowledge. These new libraries were not just places to store books. They were statements of pride, designed to reflect the dignity of learning itself. Vaulted ceilings, large windows, stone staircases, and reading rooms with carefully arranged tables and benches became the norm. Some libraries began incorporating artwork into their interiors, frescoes, inscriptions, and even sculptures that reminded visitors of the sacred duty of scholarship. In Padua, the university library was adorned with paintings of philosophers and theologians, giving students the quiet sense that they were studying under the watchful gaze of the great minds of the past. In Oxford and Cambridge, libraries expanded their collections through donations and legal deposits, slowly becoming guardians of the intellectual record of a nation. But perhaps more quietly and more profoundly, what changed most was the people using these libraries. The reader of the medieval age had shifted from a solitary monk hunched over a manuscript to a broader spectrum of humanity. Students, professors, travelers, doctors, merchants, clergy, and eventually even curious members of the public. In certain cases, libraries instituted scheduled hours where citizens could come to copy text by hand or simply read in silence. Access remained limited in many regions. Books were still rare and precious, but the gate was no longer entirely closed. The slow democratization of learning had begun. To support this expansion, new roles emerged within library staff. Beyond the head librarian, whose responsibility was to oversee the entire collection, there were now assistants, catalogers, and custodians responsible for maintaining specific rooms or subject areas. These individuals not only preserved and repaired books, but also helped patrons navigate increasingly complex catalogs. In cities like Venice, where printing was booming, librarians had to stay up to date with newly released editions, deciding what to acquire and what to discard. The task was delicate: include too much, and the shelves would become cluttered with repetition; include too little, and the library risked missing the great works of its time. The physical handling of books also remained a serious matter. Many libraries required visitors to wash their hands, remove hats, and in some cases, obtain written permission before handling rare manuscripts. The rooms were cool and dry, designed to minimize damage from humidity or pests. Lanterns were carefully positioned to avoid direct flame near the books. In places where light was limited, reading was restricted to daylight hours, with shutters adjusted to make best use of natural illumination. Even the furniture evolved. Early reading desks were simple wooden planks, but by the 16th century, some libraries featured elaborate carrels, small wooden cubicles with built-in writing surfaces, and space for ink pots and scrolls. Some were even equipped with rotating shelves, allowing scholars to consult multiple volumes at once without leaving their seats. These inventions, while modest, reflected a growing understanding of the library as not just a storehouse of books, but a workspace, an active center for study and contemplation. And this idea that the library was a place to do, not just to have, would echo into the future. As books continued to multiply, some libraries developed borrowing systems, carefully tracked through ledgers and receipts. Patrons would sign their names, list the title borrowed, and agree to return the book within a certain period. Fines were levied for late returns, though in truth, the greater threat was often theft or loss. Many books were still chained, not out of distrust, but simply because the loss of even a single volume could mean losing the only copy in the region. The reverence for books remained strong, even as their number grew. By the end of the 16th century, libraries had become more than quiet sanctuaries. They were now active participants in the intellectual life of their communities. They hosted debates, preserved correspondence between scholars, and became safe places for controversial ideas to exist on parchment, even when they could not be spoken aloud. In many ways, the library had become not just a place where knowledge was stored, but where thought was protected. As the intellectual tide of Europe swelled during the 17th century, libraries entered yet another quiet phase of transformation. Though the printing press had been in use for over a century by this point, the culture of books was still settling into its new rhythm. The printed word had become more available, more affordable, and more varied, but the infrastructure to house, organize, and preserve this flood of knowledge was still catching up. Libraries, once constructed to shelter dozens or perhaps hundreds of volumes, now face the challenge of accommodating thousands. This sudden abundance gave rise to a kind of organized anxiety: how to manage so much information, how to ensure nothing was lost, and how to teach future generations to make sense of it all. Cataloging became an art as much as a science. Early library catalogs, once simple lists or bound manuscripts, evolved into complex indexing systems. Librarians debated whether to classify books by author, subject, size, or acquisition date. Some favored alphabetical order, others preferred thematic groupings, aligning titles according to religious, scientific, philosophical, or legal content. These decisions mattered because they shaped how scholars moved through ideas, what they found, what they overlooked, and what connections they drew between works. In the great libraries of Paris, Leiden, and Rome, such questions were treated with solemn care. The architecture of libraries shifted again to reflect these changing needs. Rooms became larger, with reinforced floors to support the weight of books. Multi-level shelving was introduced, with ladders or spiral staircases leading to upper galleries. Reading rooms featured longer tables, more windows, and better ventilation. In some cases, libraries even experimented with early forms of card catalogs, little drawers with slips of paper carefully written out in ink, cross-referencing each volume by multiple attributes. The library was becoming not only a house of knowledge, but a machine of memory. The rise of national libraries also marked this era. Monarchs and governments, recognizing the symbolic power of collecting all printed knowledge within their borders, began to establish state-funded institutions. The Bibliothèque Nationale in France and the British Library in England became repositories not just of scholarship, but of cultural identity. These libraries issued legal deposit laws, requiring publishers to submit copies of every book they produced. It was an ambitious goal, to archive a nation's entire intellectual output. Though the task was daunting, it laid the groundwork for the modern idea of public knowledge as a shared resource. The role of librarians grew more formalized. Once seen as caretakers of sacred texts or scholarly aides, they now took on the responsibilities of administrators, curators, and even educators. Some were university-trained, fluent in Latin and Greek, well-versed in philosophy, and tasked not only with maintaining collections, but with advising readers. They guided researchers to obscure sources, translated difficult passages, and in some cases, corresponded with authors to clarify additions. The librarian was no longer a silent figure in the background, but an active partner in the process of learning. Despite this progress, access to libraries remained limited. Most national and university libraries still operated under restricted rules. One needed letters of recommendation, formal requests, or academic credentials to enter. In this way, the library remained both a beacon and a gate, a place of hope for the intellectually hungry, but also a place of controlled entry. Meanwhile, in the smaller towns and rural monasteries of Europe, older forms of the library quietly endured. The scent of vellum, the creak of ancient wood, the slow turning of fragile pages, all these remained part of the experience. Some monastic libraries continued to produce manuscripts, copying older texts by hand to preserve them against time and wear. Illuminated initials, decorated margins, and colorful bindings still had their place, even in an age of print. The old and the new lived side by side. These places became a kind of bridge between centuries, where the medieval reverence for books met the Renaissance hunger for expansion. It is in this tension that the beauty of the 17th century library can be found, a place where tradition and innovation quietly coexisted under the same roof. For the visitor walking its aisles, the experience was not hurried. There were no buzzing lights or computer terminals. There was only the soft sound of paper, the faint scent of leather and ink, and the echo of thoughts from another time. By the 18th century, the role of the library began to shift once again, not in dramatic waves, but in quiet, steady ripples. The Enlightenment brought with it an insatiable curiosity and a belief in reason as the highest tool of human progress. This mindset naturally extended to how knowledge was gathered, stored, and shared. Libraries started to reflect this philosophical transformation. They were no longer seen merely as vaults of ancient wisdom or sacred texts, but as active instruments of education, progress, and public enlightenment. In cities like Berlin, Vienna, Edinburgh, and Boston, libraries emerged as civic institutions, intended not just for scholars or clergy, but for the broader population. The seeds of the modern public library were quietly taking root, nourished by the belief that every citizen deserved access to the full inheritance of human thought. Reading rooms were redesigned to be more welcoming, seating expanded, light was improved, sometimes by installing new windows, and sometimes by introducing oil lamps or early gas lighting systems. Some libraries began experimenting with lending policies, allowing books to leave the building, a notion that would have been unthinkable just a century earlier. The fear that a book might be lost or mishandled was gradually outweighed by the value of making that book available to a wider audience. Library architecture in this period also became more ambitious. Influenced by the grand civic buildings of the Enlightenment, new libraries featured neoclassical facades, domed ceilings, and grand staircases. These were not just places to read, they were statements of cultural ambition, built to impress and to inspire. In many cases, sculptures or murals depicted famous authors, philosophers, and scientists, quietly reminding visitors of the intellects who came before them. The library was becoming a secular cathedral, and books its sacred objects. Meanwhile, librarians continued their evolution into a professional class. They were expected to know not only the catalog, but also the intellectual landscape. Many libraries produced detailed guides, bibliographies, and essays to help readers navigate the ever-expanding sea of books. Indexing grew more complex and refined. Subject classifications were standardized. The dream of universal knowledge, a collection that could, in theory, contain everything, seemed tantalizingly within reach. Of course, the Enlightenment was not evenly distributed. While major cities enjoyed these modern libraries, rural areas still relied on older systems or had no formal libraries at all. Traveling libraries, in the form of book wagons or itinerant librarians, attempted to bridge this gap, bringing books to villages and remote communities. These efforts were slow, but they hinted at a deeper shift, the growing belief that knowledge belonged not to the elite, but to everyone. Simultaneously, the collection policies of libraries became more deliberate. They no longer merely accepted donations or religious texts. They actively sought to gather works across disciplines: literature, science, philosophy, history, economics, and art. Some libraries even began to collect newspapers, pamphlets, and ephemera, recognizing the value of documenting current thought, not just timeless classics. The idea that a library should reflect both the enduring and the immediate was a sign of the times. One of the quieter developments of this era was the increased attention to preservation. As books aged, especially those printed on acidic paper, they began to crumble or discolor. Librarians responded with new methods of storage, binding, and repair. Leather was treated, pages were reinforced. Some libraries began to control temperature and humidity, even before the widespread use of electricity. They understood intuitively that a book's survival depended not just on being read, but on being protected. Through all this, libraries remained calm places. The noise of politics, revolution, and industry may have filled the streets outside, but inside the reading rooms, a hushed reverence prevailed. In those quiet spaces, people read silently, took notes with feather pens or graphite pencils, and occasionally exchanged knowing glances across the table. Generations passed through those halls, students, poets, engineers, clerks, each taking something with them, each leaving something behind: a fingerprint on the margin, a folded corner, a thought carried forward. And so, quietly and steadily, the library endured, not as a monument to the past, but as a passageway to the future. As the centuries rolled into the modern era, libraries did not disappear into irrelevance. Instead, they adapted with quiet determination, much like they always had. Their walls expanded, not always in stone and timber, but in scope, in reach, and in spirit. Where once a library might have housed 1,000 carefully copied manuscripts under lock and key, now it welcomed millions of printed volumes, cataloged with precision and made available to the curious mind. Whether that mind belonged to a philosopher, a farmer, or a schoolchild, the advent of the Industrial Revolution brought new challenges and possibilities. Steam power, railroads, and expanding cities changed how people lived and how they learned. Libraries became essential anchors in an age of motion. In busy towns and growing neighborhoods, they offered something rare and precious: a stillness untouched by the noise outside. no matter how much coal smoke filled the sky or how loud the machines rattled in the factories nearby. Inside the library, the air remained steady. Time seemed to move slower there. A young girl might step inside to escape the cold, then find herself lost in a book about ancient Egypt or distant stars. An old man might revisit a favorite history of battles long past, quietly reliving his own youth. These small personal moments gave libraries their soul. The rise of public education only deepened this connection. As literacy grew, so did the number of people seeking knowledge beyond what school could offer. Libraries were ready. They provided not just books but guidance, help from librarians who knew how to find what was hidden, who could point to the right shelf, the right title, the right sentence. For many, especially the poor or the newly arrived immigrants, the library was the first place they felt truly welcome. It asked for nothing, it offered everything. And through the quiet turning of pages, new worlds unfolded. The 20th century brought new formats: microfilm, vinyl records, video cassettes, computers. Libraries adapted again. They didn't resist the future. They absorbed it gently, cautiously, always with the same mission: to preserve, to share, to serve. The card catalog gave way to digital databases. Reading rooms gained electrical outlets. Old dusty corners were transformed into children's areas, computer labs, even community meeting spaces. Still, the heart of the library remained unchanged. It was not just about the information stored on the shelves. It was about the invitation it offered to sit, to think, to wander through time without ever leaving your chair. Librarians, once viewed as mere custodians of books, became information specialists. They learned how to navigate networks, manage digital archives, preserve endangered materials, and curate exhibitions. They helped patrons not just find information, but understand it, use it, apply it. In times of crisis, economic, political, even natural disasters, libraries stayed open as long as they could. They became shelters in more ways than one: for warmth, for truth, for perspective. As the internet emerged and grew, many wondered if the age of libraries was finally coming to an end. After all, if information was now everywhere, instantly accessible, why would anyone walk into a library? But what this new digital era revealed was not the obsolescence of libraries, but their importance. When everything became noisy, fast, and overwhelming, the quiet of a library became even more valuable. In a world of endless scrolls and pop-up ads, libraries still offered one thing that couldn't be downloaded: presence. You had to be there. You had to slow down. You had to listen. Today, in cities and towns around the world, libraries still stand, some in sleek modern buildings of glass and steel, others in creaky old structures with spiral staircases and dusty windows, but all of them carry a long, steady legacy. A legacy of monks in candlelight, of parchment and ink, of scholars in silence, of catalog drawers and whispered questions, of children learning to spell their names, of families borrowing cookbooks, novels, atlases, and hope. The rise of medieval libraries was never really about buildings. It was about a belief that knowledge matters, that stories endure, that human beings, when given access to wisdom, grow stronger, kinder, and more complete. And perhaps, most remarkably of all, is that this belief has survived, quietly, patiently, generation after generation, one page at a time. That brings us to the end of this story. If you're still with us, eyes gently closed, body resting still, may I kindly ask for a like and a quiet little subscribe? It truly helps us keep creating peaceful stories like this one. Now let's continue drifting through history as we arrive at the next story in our Sleepy series. A quiet night in a monastery. Get comfortable, let the silence deepen. And together, we'll step into the shadows of ancient stone walls, where the only sound is the soft turning of a page. Somewhere in the hills of medieval Europe, long before the hum of electricity or the glow of city lights, a monastery stood still beneath a sky full of stars. It was not a grand place, not in the way kings built castles or popes built cathedrals, but it was solid, humble, and serene. Thick stone walls held back the cold night air, and narrow windows let in just enough moonlight to see by. The monastery had been there for generations. Nobody alive remembered when it was first built. Some said it had always been there. Others claimed it was founded by a group of wandering monks who sought silence after a war. Whatever the truth, It had become a home to men who chose a different kind of life. A life away from markets and battles, away from family and fame, away from noise. Inside, the night unfolded not with chaos, but with order. Every sound had its place. The soft echo of sandals on stone, the rustle of robes, the gentle creak of wooden doors opening and closing. It was nearly midnight, and the brothers were preparing for nocturnes, the night prayer. In the scriptorium, a candle flickered beside an open manuscript, its pages filled with carefully inked letters. A monk had fallen asleep at his desk, quill still in hand, head gently resting on his forearm. The wax had pooled at the base of the candle, signaling that hours had passed since he last moved. No one disturbed him. He would wake in his own time. Across the hall, the refectory was silent. Long wooden benches stood empty, and the smell of herbs still lingered from supper. A pot of lentils, mostly cold, sat forgotten near the hearth. No one came here after dark, except perhaps the cook, Brother Anselm, who often tiptoed in for a cup of warm water. But tonight, even Anselm was still. Down the corridor, in the dormitory, rows of narrow beds were filled with sleeping men. Their breaths rose and fell like waves, some deep, some shallow, but all steady. They wore simple robes, and many slept with their hoods pulled up. A few clutched wooden rosaries, their fingers still wrapped around the beads. Near the end of the hall, one older monk sat upright on his cot. He wasn't praying, he wasn't reading. He was simply listening to the wind outside, to the silence within, to something only he could hear. At the far end of the monastery, a bell hung in the tower. It had not rung in hours, but soon it would call them all. Not with urgency, not with alarm, but with a slow, steady rhythm. A reminder that even in darkness, the hours belonged to something greater than sleep. The monastery's chapel was the heart of the building, small, cold, and beautiful in its stillness. A single lamp burned above the altar, casting long shadows along the stone floor. Wooden pews lined the sides, worn smooth by decades of silent prayer. The air was heavy with incense, though none had been lit since vespers. And in that space, everything felt older than time itself. As the hour neared, one by one, the monks began to stir. Some came with quiet footsteps, others limped with age, but none spoke. Their rules forbade unnecessary words after sunset. In fact, most hadn't said a single word in hours. And yet, there was understanding in every glance, in every nod, in every breath shared under candlelight. Brother Thomas, the youngest of the order, was always the first to arrive. His cheeks still held the roundness of youth, but his eyes were serious, searching. He knelt beside the altar with practiced ease, back straight, hands folded. He didn't look around. He didn't fidget. He simply waited. Behind him, Brother Hugh entered, his steps slower now than in years past. His beard had turned silver, and his fingers shook slightly as he reached for the hymn book. But he found the page without trouble. Memory, after all, had become his second skin. As the chapel filled, the silence deepened, not with absence, but with presence. They were all there together, sharing something wordless, something sacred. When the bell finally rang, it was not loud, it was not even surprising, it was simply right. A soft chime that echoed through the stone corridors, waking no one, disturbing nothing, yet touching everything. The monks stood, not quickly, not slowly, just as they had always done. Their voices began to rise, not with force, but with gentle rhythm. Latin words sung in unison echoed through the chapel. The harmonies were imperfect, a little wavering here and there, but that only made it more human, more honest. Outside, the wind brushed against the trees, and the stars watched in silence. It was just another night in the monastery, but in its quietness, it was everything. While the monks sang in the chapel, the rest of the world continued on, utterly unaware. In the village below, most windows had long gone dark. The last embers of hearth fires flickered in stone cottages. A few distant dogs barked half-heartedly, then went quiet again. No one in the village gave thought to the men on the hill who were praying beneath candlelight, and that was how the monks preferred it. Their lives were not built to be noticed. Their work was not for applause. What they preserved for time itself, not for praise, not for power, not even for comfort. Back within the monastery's ancient walls, after the soft chant of nocturnes had faded, the monks returned to their cells. Some would sleep again. Others, especially the older ones, stayed awake. Not out of insomnia, but because in the quiet of night, they found something they could never quite name, only feel. Brother Malcolm, for instance, spent many nights sitting alone in the cloister walk, a long stone hallway with arches that opened into the central garden. He would sit on the same cold bench, hands folded in his lap, eyes resting on the moonlit grass. He never brought a book, never lit a candle. He simply sat. Sometimes, a bat would flit past the arches. Sometimes, a hedgehog would scurry along the wall, but mostly, there was nothing. And that was the point. The silence was a teacher, one that spoke only when no one else did. The monastery garden, shaped like a cross, lay at the center of everything. During the day, it was where herbs were gathered, lavender, thyme, rosemary. But at night, it became a place of shadows and reflection. The moon traced its way along the stone path. Dew collected on the grass. The air smelled faintly of earth and something older. A stone well sat at the center, its bucket still and unused. They never drew water at night. That was one of those unwritten rules that no one questioned. Even the youngest brothers, like Thomas, somehow understood. Not everything needed a reason. Some things simply were. In a narrow stairwell, Brother Cedric moved slowly, lantern in hand. He had been given the task of checking the outer gates, not because there was danger. The monastery was miles from any road, and visitors were rare even in daylight. But still, every night, the gates were checked. The locks touched, the hinges listened to, just in case. Cedric didn't mind. He liked the solitude, the rhythmic steps, the smell of old stone. He often paused halfway down to look out the arrow-slit window, where a sliver of night stretched across the landscape like a velvet cloth. Sometimes he thought of his former life, a life of noise, trade, mistakes. He never told the others, but it didn't matter now. Here he had found peace. Even the animals of the monastery kept to the rhythm. The hens in the coop didn't stir. The cows in the small barn rested on their sides, breathing steadily, their bodies warm against each other. A single cat prowled the edge of the garden, pausing now and then to lick its paw or stare into the dark, as if guarding something no one else could see. In the calefactory, the warming room, a few coals still glowed in the hearth. This was the only heated room in the monastery, and even that was faint. The brothers never gathered here at night, except perhaps Brother Lucien, who struggled with cold joints. He often sat near the fire for a few minutes after nocturnes, murmuring a psalm to himself while rubbing his hands together. He never stayed long, but those few minutes were enough to remind him he was still alive, still part of something ancient and holy. In his own tiny cell, Brother Jerome kept a small carved cross at the foot of his bed. He had carved it years ago from a piece of fallen oak, during a stormy winter when the walls had leaked and several sheep had gone missing from the fields. It wasn't beautiful, the edges were uneven, but to him, it held more meaning than anything he had owned in his life before the monastery. He looked at it every night, not to pray, not to beg, just to remember. Meanwhile, above it all, the stars drifted, slowly, silently, as they had for centuries. The roof of the monastery creaked occasionally under the shift of cool air. An owl hooted once, then was silent again. The whole world felt paused, suspended in a single, breathless moment. And in that moment, nothing was asked of them. No choices, no burdens, no voices calling, only stillness, only sleep, only the quiet ticking of time echoing across the stone floors of a place built for listening, not speaking, a place that would still be standing long after every brother had turned to dust. In one of the oldest wings of the monastery, beyond a series of narrow stone corridors that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, there was a small room known simply as the scriptorium. During the day, it was where a handful of monks would copy text by hand, their quills scratching gently against parchment, their eyes squinting beneath faint light as they worked word by word, line by line. But at night, the room fell into a hush deeper than silence. The ink pots were closed, the candles extinguished, the pages left open but untouched. Yet something about the space always felt as if it were listening. Brother Anselm was the oldest of the scribes. No one knew exactly how long he had been there. Some said since before the war that had changed the borders. Others whispered he had once known a bishop personally, but he never spoke of the past. He simply showed up each morning, sat at the same desk, and copied the same words he had copied 100 times before. His script was steady, his spine curved slightly from years of leaning forward, but it was at night when he was most alive. After the others had gone to bed, Anselm often returned to the scriptorium, not to write, not even to read. He would simply sit by the wooden desk and run his fingers across the old binding of a book no longer copied, The Consolation of Philosophy. The edges of the cover were frayed, the pages yellowed. He didn't open it anymore. He didn't need to. He had memorized it long ago. He just sat there, hand resting on the surface, as if by touch alone he could stay connected to something vast and eternal. Elsewhere, Brother Henri wandered the cold hallway near the bell tower. He had never gotten used to the cold. Even after 5 winters, his fingers always ached. His ears stung. But he loved the sound of the wind when it passed through the small tower windows. It made a low humming, like a voice trying to speak across centuries. The bell itself never rang at night. That was a strict rule. But sometimes, Henri would imagine what it would sound like in the stillness. The deep, echoing chime rolling over the hills, waking no one, disturbing nothing, just a sound for the stars to hear. In the refectory, the long tables were empty, benches neatly tucked beneath them. The bowls had been washed, the bread covered. A few crumbs clung to the corners of the table, but no one minded. Cleanliness mattered, but perfection wasn't expected. Above the fireplace hung a single painting, a quiet image of a lamb in a field. No one ever talked about it, and no one knew who had painted it. It had always been there. Like the monastery itself, it asked for nothing. It simply remained. Back in his cell, Brother Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay beneath a coarse wool blanket, eyes wide, staring at the shadow of a beam above him. He had only been at the monastery for 3 months. The silence still felt unfamiliar, like an echo of a life he hadn't lived long enough to understand. He missed the sound of boots on muddy streets, missed the smell of smoke from his old home, but more than anything, he missed the feeling of not having to wonder if he was doing enough. Here, everything moved so slowly, so deliberately. Sometimes he feared he would never catch up. Other times, he feared he already had. He turned on his side, exhaled through his nose, and tried to match his breathing to the soft rustle of leaves outside his window. Down in the cellar, where the wine was stored and the air always smelled slightly of damp stone, a small candle flickered beside the barrels. Brother Louis had snuck down. Not out of disobedience, but out of a quiet need to be alone. He carried a small piece of bread in his hand and a single apple. He sat on the cool floor, back against a barrel, and ate slowly. He thought of his mother, who had died before he joined the monastery. She had made apple pie in the fall, and he always associated the scent of apples with warmth. Not warmth from a fire, but warmth from being remembered. He chewed in silence, eyes closed, the dim candlelight dancing against the barrel walls. No one knew he was there, and that was okay. Up above, the stars continued their path across the ink-black sky. The wind moved gently through the trees outside the walls, and within the monastery, the quiet remained absolute. Not empty, not lonely, just still. The kind of stillness that reminded you that time wasn't something to chase, but something to breathe in, something to sit beside, something that had never needed permission to keep moving, quietly, gently, like the ticking of a clock hidden in the stone heart of a building built for peace. At the far end of the monastery, where the stones grew darker from age and the windows narrower with each passing generation, there was a small alcove known only to a few. It wasn't marked on any of the monastery's aging hand-drawn maps. The entrance was a narrow wooden door tucked behind the old storage shelves, its handle slightly rusted, its hinges creaking softly whenever opened. No one had reason to visit it during the day, but at night, it became a quiet haven for Brother Elias. Brother Elias wasn't old, nor particularly young. He was simply one of those men whose age always seemed uncertain, whose features held the weight of memories not shared aloud. Every evening, after vespers, and after the others had gone to their cells, he would bring a small oil lamp, slip behind the shelves, and disappear into that space. Inside the alcove, there was little to see, just a narrow bench along the wall and a single stained glass window, barely wide enough for the moonlight to pass through. But that was enough. The glass, cracked in one corner, told the story of St. Julian, though much of the color had faded with time. Still, when the moon rose high and full, the remaining blues and reds painted the wall with a gentle wash of light. It was here Elias would sit and listen, not to sound, but to silence. A silence so deep, so undisturbed, it almost had texture. He would close his eyes, press his back against the cold wall, and let the quiet wrap around him like a second robe. He never spoke there. He never prayed aloud. He simply listened. For what, he never said. In another part of the monastery, Brother Matthew was writing. His candle flickered with each draft that slipped beneath his door, but he paid it no mind. He was copying from an old prayer book, a personal practice he had started years ago. Each line he copied not for necessity, but for stillness. His script was careful, measured. Each letter took its place like a stone laid in a wall. His desk faced a small wooden cross on the far side of the room, not because he needed a reminder, but because the sight of it steadied him. For him, the act of writing was a way to quiet the storm of thoughts that sometimes stirred in his mind when the monastery grew too quiet. And on nights like this, with rain softly tapping against the shuttered windows, that stillness seemed to press too close. Writing gave him space. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. The last of the embers in the hearth had cooled, and the scent of the evening meal still lingered faintly in the air. Onions, barley, and something slightly sweet. A single cup sat by the basin, forgotten or left intentionally for the morning. In the corner, a small wooden stool lay tipped on its side, as if someone had sat quickly and risen even quicker. No one would move it until morning. That was the rhythm of this place. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just time unfolding. Outside, the rain had begun to grow heavier, its drops falling steadily onto the stone paths and tiled roofs. The gardens, which had been still and dry just hours before, now shimmered under the soft silver wash of the storm. Raindrops clung to every leaf, every blade of grass. In the corner of the herb garden, a statue of Saint Benedict stood stoically, robes streaked from years of weather. Tonight, his stone face bore the familiar glaze of water running in silent streams. And near the old chapel door, a small pool had begun to form in the crevice, where the flagstones dipped. The moon reflected in it, distorted by the gentle ripple of each new raindrop. But inside the monastery, there was no rush to shelter, no sound of hurried footsteps, only the same deliberate calm that defined each hour after sunset. A candle would flicker, a monk would turn a page. Somewhere a breath would deepen, finding its rhythm in the night. Time here did not chase itself. It did not run toward morning. It simply unfolded, moment by moment. Like the quiet turning of a page, no one was reading, but everyone somehow understood. In one of the older wings of the monastery, just past the worn archways and beneath a ceiling streaked faintly with candle smoke from centuries past, a bell hung in silence. It hadn't rung in years, not because it was broken, but because its purpose had faded into the background of newer routines. But the bell still held a presence. Anyone who walked beneath it felt a curious weight, like a whisper of time pressing gently on their shoulders. Brother Anselm often passed that way during his night rounds. He wasn't assigned to patrol, not officially, but it had become his habit over the years. He would carry a small lantern, the flame shielded behind stained glass, casting a soft red glow as he moved slowly through the corridors. His steps were quiet, measured, not out of fear of waking anyone, but as a matter of respect. The stones underfoot were uneven, smoothed in places by generations of sandals and bare soles. He walked with his hands slightly extended, fingertips grazing the cold wall, as if to anchor himself in the present moment. Sometimes he would pause at the base of the bell tower, looking up into the shadows. He wouldn't climb. He didn't need to. Just the act of standing there reminded him of things that didn't need words. Things like duty, passage, and the kind of silence that listens back. In the scriptorium, Brother Thomas was still awake. He had meant to go to bed after Compline, but a small detail in one of the older texts had caught his curiosity, and now hours had passed. He sat hunched slightly forward, glasses slipping down his nose, a single candle guttering beside him. He wasn't copying tonight, he was reading. Not aloud, not for anyone but himself. The book was fragile, bound in faded leather with threadbare corners. Its pages crinkled faintly with each turn, and its scent was a mix of dust, parchment, and time. The passage he returned to, again and again, wasn't a prayer or a sermon. It was a story. A simple description of a monk who once walked the same halls, centuries ago, who tended the garden and wrote short observations of the weather, the stars, and the state of his soul. There was nothing grand in the words, and yet they held a peace Thomas couldn't quite explain. It was the kind of peace that didn't try to fix anything, didn't promise understanding, but simply stayed with you like a warm hand resting quietly on your back. Outside, the wind shifted direction, and a low creak echoed from the western gate. It wasn't unusual, the old wood often complained in storms, but tonight it lingered a little longer, like the sound of something remembering its place. The rain had softened now, tapering into a mist that curled around the stone walls and drifted along the garden paths. A fox moved silently across the gravel, its coat soaked, its head low. It paused beneath a bench, blinked up at the dark windows, then disappeared into the underbrush, leaving no trace but a few wet paw prints that would dry before dawn. Back in his cell, Brother Elias had returned from the alcove and lay awake in bed, hands folded over his chest. He wasn't praying, not in the usual sense. He was simply being, listening to the breath of the monastery, the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the hall, the shifting of wood in the ceiling as the storm loosened its grip. There were nights he would fall asleep quickly. Others he would remain in this half-state of wakefulness, not restless but watchful, as if waiting for something only silence could deliver. There was no urgency, no expectation, just a soft openness to whatever the night wanted to bring. Somewhere in the hallway, a candle burned low in its glass casing, the wax pooling quietly, the wick curling in on itself like a sleeping fern. The monastery didn't require constant care, not tonight. It took care of itself, held together by time, by habit, by the quiet faith of those who called it home. And as the night wore on, with the rain now little more than a memory, the stillness deepened, folding over the rooms like a blanket drawn gently to the chin. One by one, thoughts faded, eyes closed, not with the abruptness of sleep, but with the gentleness of trust, the kind of sleep that comes when there is nothing left to do but rest. In a small chamber tucked behind the refectory, where meals were served during daylight hours, Brother Lucian sat cross-legged on the floor, his back resting against the cool stone wall. He had finished his chores hours ago. The evening meal had been quiet, as always, and the cleaning afterward had gone swiftly, but he remained there, in the quiet hush of the room, not out of necessity, but because he found something oddly comforting in its emptiness. The long wooden tables, now scrubbed clean, stretched out in rows before him like forgotten ships in a harbor at low tide. The faint scent of baked bread and vegetable stew still lingered in the air, though it had begun to blend into the deeper scent of wood and age and wax. The candle at his side flickered gently, casting shadows that danced lazily across the benches and up the walls. Lucian reached into his robe and pulled out a small, folded scrap of paper. On it was a single verse, one he had written the week before during morning meditation. It wasn't profound, not in any scholarly sense, but it had come to him with such clarity and calm that he had kept it close ever since. He read it slowly, once more, his lips barely moving, eyes soft. The words felt more like a breath than a thought, as though they belonged more to the air around him than to his own mind. It read, "In the stillness, I find no answers, only the company of things that do not ask." And he smiled, not because he understood it, but because he didn't have to. Outside, the moon had risen higher, casting silver light through narrow windows set high in the stone walls. In the courtyard, where the rain had earlier left puddles shimmering in the torchlight, only a few patches of wetness remained, slowly evaporating into the cool night air. Crickets began their gentle chorus, not loud, just enough to remind anyone still awake that life moved on, even in the quietest hours. In the chapel, Brother Matthew knelt alone. He wasn't praying aloud. His head was bowed, his hands resting loosely in his lap. Not folded, not clenched, but open. He had come here not out of duty, but because some part of him needed to be near something that felt older than his doubts. The stained glass above him was nearly invisible in the dark, but he knew the colors by heart. He had helped repair a few of the panes last summer, standing carefully on wooden scaffolds. brushing off centuries of dust with a reverence that made his hands tremble. Tonight, though, the windows held no light. Only the feeling of something vast and quiet pressing in from the sky beyond. He whispered a single word, "Enough," not directed at anyone or anything, but released into the space around him like a pebble dropped in still water. He didn't know what it meant or what it might bring, but it felt honest, and that was enough. In the kitchen, a kettle sat on the edge of the old stove, long since cooled. Brother Henry had made tea earlier for one of the elders who couldn't sleep, and had left the second cup untouched, sitting beside the kettle like a quiet offering. No one would drink it now, but that didn't matter. The act of making it had been the point, a gesture of warmth in a place that often spoke more in action than in words. The tea had gone cold, yes, but in some way, it was still warm, simply by existing. Back in his cell, Brother Elias stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly, a fragment of dream catching in his throat. He didn't wake, didn't move much, just shifted slightly under the woolen blanket. His breathing slowed again, settled. The dream faded, leaving no trace behind. And so the night continued, unhurried, uninterested in time, wrapping itself around the monastery like a familiar shawl. Lamps burned low in their sconces, casting halos on the stone. Somewhere, a loose shutter tapped gently in the breeze. And somewhere else, too distant to disturb but near enough to be sensed, an owl called once, then fell silent. The kind of silence that doesn't press or demand. The kind of silence that holds you, even after you've fallen asleep. Far down one of the monastery's lesser-used corridors, past the scriptorium and the old herbarium, there was a tiny room with no door. It wasn't used for anything in particular. Not for prayer, not for meetings, not for rest, but the monks all seemed to know about it. They called it the listening room, not because it was meant for speaking, but precisely because it wasn't. It had one narrow window near the ceiling, shaped like a keyhole, which let in just enough moonlight to see your own hands if you held them up. The stone bench that ran along one wall was worn smooth, as if shaped by generations of quiet sitters. Tonight, Brother Thomas sat there. He wasn't meditating in the traditional sense, not repeating phrases or following a pattern of breath. He was just listening to what he couldn't say. The soft creak of the old walls settling, the faint wind weaving through the cracks in the window, the distant shuffle of sandals on cold floor from somewhere else in the building, the quiet hum of the night itself. He often came here when he didn't know what to think. It was a place that didn't require him to solve anything. In the dormitory, where the monks slept in narrow wooden cots with wool blankets folded just so, Brother Aaron rolled onto his back, eyes open. He wasn't restless in the usual way. He wasn't burdened by worry or plagued by noise. His mind simply refused to settle tonight, as if a part of him didn't want to miss the texture of these hours. He listened to the breath of the monk nearest to him, rising and falling like a tide. He stared up at the wooden beams overhead, watching the way the shadows changed shape when clouds passed over the moon outside. There was no fear here, no urgency, just the soft resistance of sleep, like a gate that hadn't opened yet. Across the hall, Brother Leon was sketching by candlelight. He wasn't supposed to, strictly speaking. The rule was to put away writing tools by evening bells, but he found that sometimes his fingers needed to move before his thoughts could rest. The small scrap of parchment in front of him bore the beginnings of a rose, just the outline of petals, curling inwards, almost like they were exhaling. His hands moved slowly, not chasing perfection, just tracing the shape of a memory. The rose had once grown in the courtyard garden beside the old stone basin. It had been cut back last winter and hadn't returned yet, but he remembered it, vividly. The way it looked in the frost, the way it smelled in June. It wasn't art, what he was making, just attention, given form. Down near the storage cellars, Brother Pascal was lighting a lantern. He had volunteered to check the lower levels that night after a small rain had seeped through one of the older walls last week. It wasn't much, just a trickle, but he wanted to be sure. The cellar smelled like earth and old apples. The barrels lining the stone walls were covered in thin layers of dust and marked in chalk with dates from years long gone. Some had cracked slightly from age and weather, but most still held firm. As he walked the narrow passage, the soft hiss of the lantern's flame echoed off the stone in a way that made the space feel alive, like a breathing body. He knelt beside the far wall, ran his hand over the floor, checking for dampness. Nothing. Dry. He exhaled slowly, not from relief, but from something deeper, a kind of quiet gratitude that he could help, in any way at all. Back upstairs, the candle in the chapel had burned down to a small golden pool around the wick. The chapel was empty now, though not abandoned. The silence that filled it was not of absence, but of presence, of patience, of waiting. Even the statues along the walls seemed to lean into the quiet, their stone faces soft in shadow. Outside the walls of the monastery, the world slept too. Villages tucked into the hills, small fires reduced to embers, dogs curled beneath porches, leaves whispering along cobblestones. But here, in this place set apart, time moved differently. It didn't hurry, it didn't chase, it listened, it held. And within its stillness, the monks kept their quiet watch, each in their own way, each part of a rhythm too old to measure and too gentle to disturb. The night, like a long breath, continued. There was a quiet rhythm to the way the monastery breathed at night, not with lungs, but with small, simple movements, the swing of a wooden door on old hinges, the soft click of a latch, the dry shuffle of sandals on worn stone. And somewhere within that rhythm, Brother Elias rose from his cot, careful not to wake the two brothers sleeping beside him. He moved slowly, his fingers grazing the edge of the rough wool blanket as he folded it neatly. He had not planned to rise early, but something in him stirred, an instinct more than a thought. He wrapped his robe tighter around his chest, shielding himself from the chill that clung to the old stones, and stepped into the corridor. The halls were dim, only faint slivers of moonlight peeking through high-set windows. But Elias didn't need to see much. He had walked this path thousands of times. His feet knew the way. He passed the old oil painting of St. Ambrose, faded and cracked with time. He passed the row of hooks where wet cloaks hung like silent sentinels. Then finally he entered the refectory, not to eat, but just to be still. The benches sat empty but not lonely. There was always something welcoming about the room. The long table still held the faint scent of yesterday's bread, of herbs dried on windowsills, of the lingering echoes of voices that had once filled it with prayer and stories and laughter. Brother Elias sat down at the far end of the table, where the candle stubs waited to be replaced in the morning. He placed his hands flat on the wood and breathed, not deeply, not with effort, but with the kind of breath that simply lets itself happen. No weight, no reason, just breath. In the cloister garden, outside the east wing, Brother Matthew stood under the covered walkway, watching the stars. He hadn't come here looking for answers. He didn't believe the night owed him any, but sometimes, when the moon was high and the wind quieted, he liked to stand beneath the wooden beams and look up, as if the sky might nod back. The garden below was sleeping, herbs curled under linen wraps, soil damp from last week's rain, a few stubborn ivy leaves holding onto the stone wall like memories refusing to let go. Matthew watched his breath cloud in the air and disappear. He thought about the brothers who used to walk these very stones and how little they had left behind. No writings, no statues, no names carved in stone. And yet their lives still echoed here, not loudly, but enough to be felt in the hush. On the other side of the monastery, Brother Jude lit a taper from the last ember of the fireplace. He had always liked tending to the hearth. It reminded him of his childhood home in the hills, where his mother used to wake early to stoke the morning flame. He didn't speak of her often, not because he didn't miss her, but because her presence lived in his actions. Every time he placed wood just so, every time he coaxed a flame from cold ash, it was her hands he remembered. Tonight the fire didn't need to be lit. It was warm enough, but Jude did it anyway. Just a small flame, just enough light to warm the silence. He sat there cross-legged, the fire flickering quietly beside him, casting shadows across the floor that danced like thoughts just out of reach. He didn't think about tomorrow. He didn't think about the years behind him. He only watched, and breathed, and stayed. In the library, a place where talking was discouraged even during daylight, Brother Isaac wandered the shelves like a man visiting old friends. He trailed his fingers along the spines of parchment-bound volumes, some centuries old, others copied only last year. He didn't open any tonight. He wasn't here to read. He just needed the nearness of the words. Sometimes he wondered if the books, though silent, could still listen, if the ink remembered the hands that formed it, if the pages held the breath of monks who once whispered their prayers while copying each line. The air in the library was cool, touched with the faint scent of dust and lavender oil used to keep moths away. He closed his eyes and listened for the one thing that was always there in this room: stillness, olive and waiting. Somewhere in the shadows of the choir loft, Brother Samuel sat against the wooden rail, his hands folded in his lap. He had once been a singer, years ago, before his voice changed with age, but he still came here sometimes, not to sing, but to remember the shape of song. The way the notes once rose in his chest, the way they lingered in the vaulted ceilings like morning mist. He didn't miss the applause or the practice, just the harmony, just the feeling of being part of something larger than sound. As the hours crept forward, unnoticed by the world outside, the monastery held its breath, not in waiting, not in fear, but in presence. A quiet so complete it didn't need to be filled. A silence so alive it held the weight of 1,000 whispered prayers. As the night stretched deeper into silence, the monks of the monastery settled even further into their chosen rhythms of peace. No bells rang, no footsteps echoed loudly. Time itself seemed to pause between breaths, as if the very air of the cloister recognized the sacredness of the hour. In the narrow room beside the scriptorium, Brother Lawrence sat at a desk lit only by the faint glow of a lantern. The flame flickered gently, casting a soft amber circle over the parchment in front of him. He wasn't writing tonight. His quill rested idle, his ink pot unopened, but he liked to be near the tools of his trade: the worn wooden stylus, the metal ruler, the scrolls stacked neatly on the shelf. He liked to sit and remember the verses he had spent months transcribing: psalms, letters, the wisdom of saints and scholars long gone. And even though the room was still, he could almost hear their words again, whispering through memory, winding gently through the stillness. Sometimes, when sleep wouldn't come, Brother Lawrence would copy out a line not because it was needed, but simply because he missed the motion, the slow, deliberate curve of each letter, the way silence deepened when ink touched paper. But tonight, he simply rested his hands on the desk and let the quiet settle around him like a second robe. In the tiny infirmary near the western edge of the monastery, Brother Daniel tended to a sleeping novice, a young boy named Thomas who had taken ill during the week. It was nothing grave, just a seasonal fever, the kind that comes and goes with the turning of the leaves. But Brother Daniel stayed by his side through the night, checking his brow, adjusting the blanket, whispering a psalm under his breath now and then. The room smelled faintly of mint and chamomile, steeped in warm water and kept in clay bowls by the bedside. Thomas stirred once in his sleep, mumbling something soft and uncertain. Brother Daniel gently touched his shoulder, soothing him with a whisper, and the boy stilled again. It reminded Daniel of his first year in the monastery, decades ago, when he too had shivered under linen sheets and someone older, kinder, had watched over him until morning. That memory, long buried beneath years of service, rose like a warm tide, and he found himself quietly humming the same lullaby he had once been sung. In the bell tower above the cloister, Brother Simon stood at the open arch, looking out over the fields beyond the monastery walls. The village in the distance lay quiet, a few scattered lights flickering like stars fallen to earth. He could see the faint outline of trees, the soft glow of the moonlight tracing the tops of hedgerows and chapel roofs. The wind here was stronger, cutting through his robe and tugging gently at his sleeves, but he didn't mind. He came here not for warmth, but for perspective. From this high place, the world looked smaller, more manageable. The sorrows he carried, the prayers for lost loved ones, for old friends who no longer wrote, for hopes that had faded, felt quieter up here, like stones smoothed by time. He let the cool air press against his face, let it fill his lungs and clear his thoughts. He didn't speak. He didn't pray out loud. He just stood, open to the night, and listened to the wind thread its way through the ancient stones. Below, in the chapel, Brother Anthony lit a single candle and placed it on the altar. He wasn't there for ritual, not in the formal sense. He was there because sometimes the chapel felt more like a person than a place, one who listened patiently and never rushed him. The candle flickered quietly, its light dancing along the carved edges of the wooden cross. Brother Anthony didn't kneel. He simply sat on the front pew and looked upward, toward the high arches that disappeared into shadow. He thought about the first time he entered this place, how overwhelmed he had felt by its size and silence, how unsure he had been of his path. And now, years later, the silence no longer frightened him. It welcomed him. It wrapped itself around his doubts and softened them. He closed his eyes and let his thoughts wander, not to problems, not to plans, just to presence. Just to the fact that he was here, alive, breathing in the same air that monks had breathed centuries before him. In the small garden shed behind the abbey kitchen, Brother Paul polished the old gardening tools. No one had asked him to. No one would have noticed if he hadn't. But he believed that even the smallest tasks deserved attention. The wooden handles, worn from decades of use, felt smooth beneath his cloth. He moved slowly, carefully, as if polishing something sacred. To him, these weren't just tools. They were extensions of a quiet ministry. The spade that had dug trenches for winter vegetables, the shears that had trimmed the vines growing wild over the cloister wall, the watering can that had quenched the thirsty herbs lining the windowsills. He remembered each use, each season, each small moment of care. And as he placed the tools back on their hooks, perfectly aligned, he felt something within him settle. A kind of peace that came not from grand gestures or deep revelations, but from doing small things with steady hands and an open heart. In every corner of the monastery, from the tallest bell tower to the simplest wooden bench, the night deepened like a warm blanket being pulled gently over the soul. The wind whispered secrets through cracks in the stone. The candles burned low, and though not a single voice was raised, the whole monastery seemed to hum with quiet devotion. Not loud, not proud, just present, just awake, just enough. As midnight arrived, though no bell marked the moment, a subtle shift passed over the monastery, like the softest breath. The wind, which had whispered all evening, slowed to a hush. The air within the stone corridors turned cooler, not cold, but gently reminding anyone awake that the world outside continued to turn, even while their footsteps paused. In the dormitory, the monks lay in their narrow beds, their breathing soft and even, blankets pulled to their shoulders. The old wooden floorboards groaned just slightly under the weight of the night air settling in. Brother Elias, the oldest of them all, lay with his hands folded over his chest, not sleeping, but not quite awake either. His eyes were closed, yet his mind wandered freely. At nearly 80, he no longer needed as much sleep as the others. Instead, he drifted between thoughts and memory like a leaf on a still pond. He recalled a winter from decades ago, when the snow had piled so high, the monks had to dig tunnels to reach the chapel. He remembered the warm laughter over dry bread and cheese, the steam rising from their simple soup, the stories told softly so as not to disturb the peace. These weren't grand tales or moments of worldly glory, but they stayed with him, glowing softly, just like the candle he kept beside his bed. In the cloister garden, the moonlight spilled across the gravel paths in long, pale ribbons. Shadows of the cloister arches stretched across the stone like fingers reaching inward. A lone cat, small and gray, crept silently along the garden wall. It was not owned by the monks, yet it had lived here for years, as much a part of the community as any brother. They called her Lucia, and though she never came when called, she always arrived during the night, patrolling the garden as if protecting it. She paused beneath the fig tree, her ears twitching at a distant rustle, then continued along the stone path, her paws soundless against the cold surface. In the kitchen, long since emptied of the clatter of pots and pans, Brother Julian entered with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He placed it gently on the long wooden counter, unwrapping 2 crusts of bread and a soft wedge of cheese. A modest meal, just enough. He wasn't hungry, not really, but this was his quiet ritual. Each night before sleep, he offered a portion of his portion. He took 1 piece of bread and placed it on a plate near the rear door, the spot where a passing traveler or a poor farmer might come by at dawn. No one had asked him to do it. No rule required it. But years ago, he had once been given food when he needed it most. And since joining the monastery, he had never forgotten. The simple act of preparing something for someone he would never meet brought him peace. In the library, which rarely saw visitors after dusk, Brother Matthew remained at a small corner table, surrounded by parchment scrolls and bound volumes. He wasn't studying theology or copying a sacred text tonight. Instead, he was translating a faded letter sent from another abbey a century ago. It wasn't urgent, nor especially important, but it was a connection to someone who had once sat under a similar roof, reading by candlelight just as he did now. The letter spoke of spring rains, of planting barley, of a brother named Anselm who had taken ill and recovered with the help of warm broth and prayer. Ordinary things, quiet things, but Matthew found comfort in them. It reminded him that lives long past were not so different. People still worried, hoped, and gave thanks for small kindnesses. Back in the chapel, the candle Brother Anthony had lit was now a small glowing nub, its flame barely dancing, and yet the warmth it gave off lingered, casting a soft amber light on the wooden altar. Outside the stained glass windows, the stars blinked faintly, almost shy. The world was utterly still, the kind of stillness that presses gently on the heart and says, "You are here, and that is enough." In the guest quarters, empty for weeks now, the beds were neatly made, each pillow fluffed, each blanket folded with care. No one would likely arrive tonight, and yet the monks maintained this room with the same devotion as the rest of the monastery. For them, hospitality was not about who arrived, but about being ready, always ready. In case a traveler knocked at dawn, in case a stranger came with questions, with burdens, with stories of their own. The room waited, not with impatience, but with quiet dignity. The final hour before dawn crept in gently, unnoticed by most, but the monastery felt it. A slight shift in the weight of darkness, the faintest hint of color along the eastern sky. The cold stone floors no longer seemed quite so harsh. The scent of the herb garden drifted in with the breeze through the window slits, rosemary, thyme, and the faintest trace of lavender. Somewhere in the distance, a bird stirred, not yet singing, just shifting in its nest, sensing that morning was near. And so the monastery remained, still, devoted, and calm. Not a single word spoken, not a single light forced. Just a collection of men and memories wrapped in silence, doing their work, holding their prayers, carrying on not for glory or attention, but because the night is sacred. Because peace, in its smallest form, is still peace. Because even the quietest life, when lived with care, leaves behind echoes that never quite fade. And as the horizon began to lighten, just slightly, the monks began to stir once more, not with haste, not with noise, but with the same gentle rhythm that had carried them through the darkness. The night was ending, but the peace remained. Thank you for watching this video. May your morning be filled with quiet joy and gentle luck when you wake. We'll see you again soon, right here on Sleep Whisper.